Can somebody
Yes,
say that they hear me?
I hear you.
Okay. All right. So let me welcome you all to the conference by CITI, or State of Telecom 2000. Um, and our topic is, are those kind of are there remaining bottlenecks? And if so, what is the problem? And if so, what can we do about it? I'm the director of the institute. I'm also a professor of finance and economics at Columbia Business School. Uh, and the reason why we chose this topic was partly because competition and establishing competition has been and protecting it a key element of media and telecom and communications policy for a long time, an active policy with the United States in taking a leadership role. More recently, these issues have moved to the internet space. Net neutrality was one battleground, and now there is the calls for the exercise of control over content by social networks and search engines, fake news, the hate speech. So control issues is a battle that never ends, and the battlefronts keep evolving. So I thought this would be an interesting, important topic. Partly it's also based on a book that we in here, a collaboration with me at the end, owns the world's media book in media economics and management of the year. And so market power issues were therefore on our minds. Um, Now, the forces of entrepreneurship and technological innovation will drive change here, and they will potentially drive it with certain dynamics towards a more oligopolistic market structure. That's at least what people have been talking about. But other people, particular from the internet community, often do not wish to discuss these issues. Why not? Because it might give the wrong people, such as politicians and other strange species, to do harm by cracking down, by regulating, and so better kind of to be quiet. I think this is an ostrich-like response. These issues will be out there. They will be discussed. Much better to participate in an informed discussion right from the beginning. And it's important because economically, market concentration here might affect prices and service conditions and quality. Technologically, it might affect innovation negatively or positively. Societally, it might affect diversity of information sources, etc. Market concentration has been a particular issue in the ICT and media field. And why is that? And partly it's because the enormous economies of scale, high fixed costs, low marginal costs that are fundamentally there. There are the network effects. There's the distance insensitivity. So scale is enormous here and favors large firms, large market shares, oligopolistic. And if that's the case, then what is there to do? Well, if anything, well, the first option is to do nothing, but to the libertarian approach, to let market forces, innovation, entrepreneurship deal with the issue. Is there regulation of what firms may or may not do? Third is the regulation of market structure, such as antitrust rules. Fourth is the encouragement and subsidization of competitive alternatives. And fifth is perhaps a slowdown of the successful companies, which has been the approach in several countries and regions, just kind of make it miserable for them to do business. So now today we're going to discuss not so much the potential bottleneck, because the net neutrality just dealt with that extent, but we'll deal more upstream, the middle mile of CDNs and the cloud infrastructure platforms and the big four of the internet, the FANGs in America, or GAFAMs in Europe, which if you actually add them up, more like 6 companies that well, you know who they are. So we've had many conferences over the years. This is the first of our State of Telecom annual conferences that we're doing virtually online, partly to practice what we preach, although we've kind of streamed most of our events already in the past, but this time there is not even a physical counterpart to it, because for a variety of reasons, and some of the nice aspects of it is that we have many people, friends, old friends and new ones around the world participating, or around the country participating in ways that they kind of were perhaps too burdensome in the past. And so these are my words of welcome. You as the audience can participate, first of all, by video. We see you often. Or you call in by audio phone line. You can make comments and participate, ask questions, raise your hand electronically, and the moderator or I will recognize you. Meanwhile, please mute your audio, or else we will all hear your babies in the background making noise, etc. So we have three great panels and a great audience. Let's get started. The first panel is moderated by Bob Pepper, not as listed Bob Atkinson. Bob Atkinson will moderate the second session. Bob Pepper is not only needs no introduction, but I will do it anyway in the sense that he's also the chairman of the advisory board of CITI, and we're very happy and glad that he's has lent his help, assistance, wisdom, and support to us. Bob is at Facebook now. Cisco before that he was at the FCC, head of the policy planning group that was essentially, as I described it in the past, he was kind of the brains of several FCC chairmen in the past. And he's well known, well traveled around the world. So Bob, without further ado, go ahead with the.
Thanks, Ellie. I really appreciate it. If people, again, as Ellie said, if you could mute yourself, that would be great. I don't know, Jason, if you're going to be able to. You'll be able to, as administrator, mute people if there's noise. So, as Ellie said, this first session in terms of the discussion, we have Tom Hazlett and Rob Frieden, and I'm not quite, since I see Rob's slide up on the presentation screen, I guess we're going to start with Rob. And as Ellie pointed out, there's this discussion about whether it's for example, the front page of today's Wall Street Journal about Google, or in the Financial Times earlier this week, or in fact yesterday, a Financial Times piece about how Walmart is actually coming back to be able to compete in the e-commerce space with Amazon after people assumed that nobody would ever compete with Amazon. The question is about this evolution of the digital economy. And
just give me a second.
And it's really beyond just the media.
Can I please have a second to fix this? Because
yeah, if you could mute yourself.
Jason's the one that
needs to mute himself, right? So the questions are about how the market is evolving, levels of competition, how we need to think about competition and even define markets going forward. Come back to some of those things. So Rob, why don't I turn it over to you for a short presentation to start off the conversation, and then Tom will turn to you. So Rob, are you on?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks very much for this opportunity. I'm very grateful to be able to participate, and I've got rather extensive slides that could take the better part of an hour, which I won't take, but I'm glad to share them with you. If we could go to the second slide, the main points may be as far as we'll go. I want to underscore, starting, that I'm not calling for more regulation or the nationalization or Wikipediaization of social networks or any platform whatsoever. On the other hand, I think it's very important to look at both sides of what's called a double-sided market, both the downstream flow to subscribers and then the upstream flow to content providers, app creators, CDNs, content distribution networks, and the like. Speaking of like, I think there's a lot to like about platform operation. It's not something that just appeared. We've had intermediaries from day one in commerce, and in this space we've had broadcasters, networks, and the like. Credit card vendors are another example of long-standing intermediaries. On the other hand, with digitization and broadband, we now have the opportunity for internet platform operators to accrue great scale, positive networking externalities, and some would say, even though there are competitive multi-homing opportunities, that some of these markets, social networks being one, can capture large market share in a winner-take-all sort of sweepstakes. Further in my analysis, I'm not so convinced that just market share is the the be-all for all measures of what is good or bad for consumers. In the United States, my view is that the three major agencies, regulatory agencies, the Justice Department, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Federal Communications Commission, are using flawed market assessments, poorly calibrated tools to look at the digital and internet ecosystem and these two-sided markets. There's great emphasis on the downstream impact, and if anything, one of the sort of sub-thoughts in the paper I'm working on is that maybe we've been too concentrated on the downstream flow, particularly insofar as the issue of network neutrality. From my view, the existing regulatory regime has the potential for both false positives and false negatives. False positives in that you have ex-ante regulation, you anticipate that there's a problem, you anticipate that consumers and competition will suffer, therefore you create a regulatory regime. On the other hand, ex post, after the fact, remedies might occur, if at all, after the harm has occurred, and you might not have justice delayed is justice denied. The Justice Department uses a Chicago school economic model that basically says if consumers are accruing short-term benefits, and there are lots of benefits, then really there shouldn't be any intervention on the part of the government. The Federal Trade Commission has shared jurisdiction with the FCC. There's uncertainty as to the scope of its regulation.
Helen's trying to intervene for a second.
Sure.
Rob, could somebody where there's a vacuum cleaner or something like that in the background, please mute your microphone?
Yeah, everybody should just mute except when you want to speak. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that vacuum cleaner is heard across. Okay. All right. Okay, I think it is Rob's vacuum cleaner. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, I think they're sucking up leaves outside my office right now, I think. At any rate, the Federal Trade Commission has shared jurisdiction with the FCC, and it's unclear as to what their scope of interest and skills are. They aren't involved in carriage issues and common carrier issues in particular. And then the FCC, as mentioned, has an emphasis on downstream impact insofar as network neutrality, but there's a lot of sort of issues that you wouldn't expect to drive FCC outcome, and in part it's a political orientation and who's in the majority. So my view is that governments need to assess both sides of the two-sided market. So if we go to the next slide, I'll go quickly through the concept of double-sided markets, and it's something that I think most of our participants are familiar with. You can substitute in the center cable television company, network, social network, pay system or whatnot, upstream content providers, app generators, creators, software creators, and then downstream consumers. There are three, if we go to the next slide, three that we can look at in the internet ecosystem: ISPs. This slide just basically says it's something that's already working in the information, communications, and entertainment marketplace, the ICE marketplace, broadcast networks. The next slide talks to the ISP as an intermediary or platform. If we can go to that one quickly. The ISP serving the last mile is the Comcast, the Cox Communications, what have you. And then upstream, there's CDNs and content providers. We also have intermediaries who are generating operating systems for wireless. That's the next slide, quickly. And then the next slide after that are social networks and the like. That's three different ecosystems. So if we go to the next slide very, very quickly, there are a lot of good things to say about the intermediary double-sided configuration, particularly in the internet ecosystem. There's scale and efficiency gains, and in particular, the platform operator is able to calibrate, well, who's going to pay for this? And in many, many instances, there are free rider opportunities whereby the consumer on the downstream flow gets a free credit card or gets to borrow money for 30 days at no interest, and you don't have to pay for the card, for example. So the broadband platform operator can calibrate who's going to pay, and in many instances there are opportunities for a lot of consumer welfare enhancement. The next slide identifies some of the downsides, particularly if you look at both sides of the market. We know that there are really very positive gains for consumers. Amazon, for years now, has offered a very attractive price point for a lot of services. They want to get shelf space, they want to get market share, and they're less concerned about profitability. And that really goes against the Chicago school mindset that says you would never predatorily price or promotionally price for too long because there's no certainty as to when you would be able to recoup that. At any rate, if you look upstream, there are all sorts of consequences of platform operators insofar as the quid pro quo of providing a very attractive service like participating in Facebook's social networking in exchange for allowing Facebook to collect data, to analyze that data, to market that data, and like. Often consumers don't necessarily read their subscription agreements and understand what they're giving up in terms of value. Similarly, intermediaries like Amazon, if they really wanted to sharpen their pencils, could use what's called dynamic pricing or surge pricing to calibrate with great specificity and alacrity exactly how much to charge each individual customer, sort of sizing them up the way a used car dealer might in the physical world. Surge pricing is something that consumers love when it results in a low price, but if you're going to a New Year's Eve party or a Christmas party or whatnot, and there's a lot of demand, that they really sort of recoil from significantly higher prices. Consumers may not know or have a sense of really what the quid pro quo is. If we could go to the next slide, please. So part of the whole question as to the power of intermediaries is whether they've sort of locked in consumers, they've sort of taken control over the ecosystem, and you have things like the gig economy and impact on corner stores and bookstores and the like. So there are significant upstream consequences. I'm saying that the cost-benefit analysis is very important in terms of looking at both sides of the platform or intermediary function. AT&T gave us a little snapshot of the value of that upstream analysis when, for a very, very short period of time, some of their UVerse wireline broadband subscribers were presented with a proposition that if they paid $29 extra per month, that the company, AT&T Wireline UVerse, would use less data analytics, less data mining. That generated a lot of consumer pushback, but it didn't necessarily result in less data mining or discounts. If we could go to the next slide, please. So just very quickly, because I want to fit within the 10 minutes, the Justice Department has a view very much embracing the Chicago school reticence to get involved in mergers and acquisitions, and a lot of this has to do with a sort of vertical analysis, not unlike the AT&T Time Warner acquisition. The next slide talks about the Federal Trade Commission and the FCC. Suffice to say that my view is that some of their analysis is not necessarily working with great calibration in this internet ecosystem. We can go past the next slide and the next slide quickly, FTC, FCC. Now to the conclusions, please. First of all, I think consumers and governments aren't fully apprised of the trade-offs, both upstream and downstream, particularly when intermediaries have accrued economies of scale and efficiency and networking effects and the like. It's increasingly clear, I think, that consumers have to contribute more in value or don't appreciate what they contribute in exchange for access to what the social network has to offer. There's a case, because I have a law background, I'm not an economist, and we have an economist on the panel, but there's a case involving United States versus American Express, which I think is very instructional. It's a very complicated case, but suffice it to say, American Express has a no steering policy for vendors who offer or who will accept the card. A no steering policy means that you can't, as a vendor, say, well, don't use American Express, use Visa because it's cheaper for us. And the lower court said that anti-steering language in an affiliation between the credit card company and the vendor is bad, bad, bad. And the appellate court, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, said, no, wait a minute, let's look at both sides. Maybe that anti-steering language enables American Express to be competitive in the marketplace, and maybe a fourth credit card company is good. And besides, if you look at both sides, holistically, there's a lot that maybe American Express can offer by way of free rider opportunities or consumer welfare enhancement opportunities that it wouldn't be able to do if it weren't in the business or if it didn't have that anti-steering language. So that's a case I call your attention to. It's a little heavy lifting in the analysis, but I think the bottom line point is that what appears to be something that's consumer benefiting may not be so if you look holistically. Next slide, please. So I'm going to wrap up with just a view that government agencies need to assess market impacts, not necessarily just market share, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index of percentage market penetration. There's a lot of interactivity between both sides, and platform intermediary operation is going to have significant effects both downstream and upstream. And if there's one thing I can emphasize, it's that we're not paying attention to that upstream flow. So I think I'm within 10 minutes. I reserve the balance of my time, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Rob. Actually, you were right on.
Thank you. I rehearsed.
Yeah, good. So I've got a bunch of questions, but first I want to turn to Tom Hazlett, the economist on the panel, to get Tom's perspective. Tom, can you hear us? I can hear you fine. Are you, so you're just on the phone, or are you going to, oh, I can actually see you from the video.
Hi, Anna.
Okay, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I'm giving a shout out to Anna. Nice to see you.
And she's waving her hands. That's great.
And she's there. Great. Thank you for having me, and I'm delighted to participate. I hope I can bring something to the virtual table here, but I'm really keen to learn. I know this session has been planned for some time, but given that, the convergence of events here is eerie. You folks, just to pump demand for this discussion, apparently have been arranging hearings in Washington and controversies around the planet. So I'm duly respectful of your ability to orchestrate events. But there are wild times, of course, in tech sector politics, and the laissez-faire that has been the Silicon Valley mantra seems to be challenged in a way that's potentially fundamental. Some might call it the revenge of the regulators, because there is this political flow from multiple sides of the fence. You certainly see conservatives now in extraordinary terms talking about invoking the fairness doctrine. Newt Gingrich striking out to say that the new platforms and social media are public utilities, need to be regulated as we did for electrical grids a century ago. And of course, there's a lot of sentiment on I suppose all sides of the spectrum now to push net neutrality from the core to the edge. It's funny when you see people accusing other political parties of hypocrisy on this, for being in favor of net neutrality for one set and against it for another, and then the hypocrisy is repeated by simply those allegations of hypocrisy, because it seems that that's very confusing to keep up with what people are for and against. Anyway, that's the Washington dance. That's the politics of it. You know, the question is where we go in the marketplace, and of course regulators have a hand in that. That's the exciting part, the part that you're talking about and everybody is interested in. But from the market side, there is this very fundamental decision-making process. It's been going on, obviously, for decades, and it's coming to the fore, and that is how the firms view themselves, either as common carriers or as curated platforms. And there are certainly a lot of arguments in favor of either. And what we're seeing is shifts in the business models and shifts in the demand on the part of the public, both as consumers and as voters, to perhaps have firms do things differently. Regulators hear these and then they respond. But there's no easy answer to this. Of course, the firms have very complex calculations as to exactly how to formulate their business models. And in essence, the firms, the social media platforms, search engines, and so forth, have a very large interest in neutrality. But they're also quite aware that in responding to customers, there is a demand for editing and curation and putting some walls up. Walled garden became a term of pejorative, but to some extent, of course, the people like gardens, people like walls that help parties tend to the garden. And so the question is not whether or not there's going to be some of that, but how high those walls are and where do you put them. So it's quite interesting now. You have companies like Federal Express, not considered perhaps an internet carrier, but they explicitly state that they are a common carrier. They are not a regulated common carrier. They are a voluntary private sector common carrier by their own design. They do not want to inspect the packages. They have been given liability by U.S. government actions, and the Federal Express response is, we are a common carrier. We do not inspect packages. If people are shipping things they should not be shipping, please go after the shippers. So they adopt this very explicitly. By the way, their close competitor, UPS, has a different business model, and they explicitly state that they are not a common carrier. They reserve the right to discriminate amongst shipments. Now, it is interesting, a recent development of Lyft and Uber actually banning certain customers on the basis of their tweets. And this may be on the sort of the far side of what people are talking about. It's not it's not Twitter, it's not Facebook, it's not Google. The information platforms, it's a service platform, if you will, for ride sharing. And yet there are some customers who, because of their views, and presumably because the companies, the software apps, as they call themselves, are not service providers, they're just apps, they are protecting certain users of their apps, in this case probably the drivers, from people who tweet things that are considered offensive to those core constituents or stakeholders. But it's quite an interesting move that these kinds of companies now are becoming much more active editors and stepping away from common carriage. Of course, Facebook is trying to create some walls, some spaces, some gardens. that protect certain types of users of their software. And you can certainly see this to some extent, Google and elsewhere, Twitter, and down the list. They're trying this delicate balance, neither fish nor fowl, common carrier nor edited publication. They do want to invite a maximum coverage, but you have trade-offs on both sides. I don't have the answer for you right here. I hope that policy is not herky-jerk, that there are not ad hoc rules that get a political wind and immediately blow into the marketplace as mandates. Rob Frieden, who we've just heard, does talk about false positives and false negatives getting through the regulatory screens, allowing things that may be dangerous to customers versus having too much regulation and suppressing innovations that would be valuable to customers. I do have my own priors on this, certainly, having studied radio spectrum and being the author of a recent book, The Political Spectrum, The Tumultuous Liberation of Wireless Technology from Herbert Hoover to the Smartphone, Yale University Press, 2017. Please click on Amazon. The story in radio spectrum allocation is certainly that the type 2 errors, the suppression of valuable resources that could come into the market to spur innovation, that has been the overwhelmingly large problem. Allowing too much market competition has really not been the factor that is registered as a social problem. So yeah, we have our views as to how other markets and other evolutions have played out in communications or the economy in general, and of course that's why we call certain views the Chicago view or the anti-Chicago view. These are informed opinions that result in certain models of the world that tend to look in different directions. But that's the debate we're in now. I hope that there is an evolution in the marketplace that allows these firms to adopt rules that do respond to their customers and do have maximum scope given the underlying legal regime of the United States and other countries to serve customers. So no PowerPoint slides. I'm in a 12-step program to give up on PowerPoint, so I'm only on step 3. So it's a work in progress. But I hope I don't break out in cold sweats. And anyway, I thank you for giving me a slot on the panel.
Thanks, Tom. That was actually very useful. Speaking of the PowerPoint addiction, we still are looking at Rob's PowerPoint slide. So Jason, I don't know whether we want to just leave that up or we can sort of stop sharing PowerPoint at this point so we can see more people, more of the participants on the screen. That would be, I think, a useful thing. So I have some questions, but I'd like to open it up, and I'm not quite sure with people raising their hands how I see that, or whether Jason, you're going to see that and open it up. But I would like to. This has been a very U.S.-centric conversation, and as Ellie said, it's actually a global conversation, global debate. And I know that we have people from around the world and people with international perspectives. So if somebody who's in the room, as we would say, that has a perspective, a global perspective, or a perspective from another country, that would be great. You can raise your hand or just unmute and speak, and we'll figure out how to find you. Nobody? Okay. I'd like also to go back though to did somebody? No. Jason, are you able to see people raise their hands?
Can we raise our voices?
Yes, raise your voice. Hi, Loretta.
Hi, Bob. This is a couple of us from the European Commission, And it was hard to get in from some computers, but we succeeded, so we're all in one room.
That's great.
Sometimes you can't trust the machines. They're each individualistic. There's no equality of access. Anyway, I wanted to agree with Tom Hazlitt on the fact that we're seeing a revenge of the regulators, and that the laissez-faire capitalism of Silicon Valley is gone. And there are two issues, of course, is that taxation is one that is prevalent, but also the opening up to innovation from startups, which was also mentioned by Ellie as the one factor that changes oligopolistic markets. And so I wanted to ask the panel to comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Loretta. Good to hear you. Rob, Tom, do you want to talk about that? And I'd like to just say one thing about the taxation issue from the perspective of somebody watching from this side of the Atlantic. You know, the taxation questions, which have become now sort of global, the OECD is looking for ways to address or have recommendations to address some of the what appears to be tax arbitrage. But from this side of the Atlantic, it appears that the taxation arbitrage opportunities were created by countries, not companies, and that companies have been following the law, and that they have merely been taking advantage of the differences in the different tax structures in different countries, particularly within and among European countries. And that the taxation issue, which is an important one for countries, is being used as a way to actually address what otherwise would be competition questions. So, you know, and so maybe, Loretta, you and your colleagues from the Commission might want to respond to that, but let me hear first from Tom and Rob. Tom?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Loretta. I probably should say I'm not rejoicing in the revenge of the regulators or bemoaning the fact that there has been largely a laissez-faire policy. It's I think people should be clear about where we are. So these changes are taking place, certainly, but the laissez-faire umbrella over Silicon Valley has produced a lot, and people should be aware of that. Certainly, the arbitrage issue is a difficult one for governments. When governments are charging differential rates, you know, through the tax system, mobility is their enemy, and mobility, I mean, through the internet, that's the ultimate reduction of friction. And you're going to have new challenges for how you finance government. The public finance questions obviously put governments in the same quandary, not in identical dimensions or terms, but very similar or parallel to what the companies are facing with the changing business models. So in terms of the international global policies and companies facing different environments, yeah, non-harmonization is a big problem. Certainly these international firms doing business in 200 markets have their hands full. People flying around the world like Bob Pepper, trying to find out what the you know, what the local policies are is a very big part of their business and a very important line item in the budget. Ideally, harmonization is where we like to be, but we still want competition between jurisdictions because we want there to be you know, those forces you know, to constrain monopoly, whether it be on the private or the state side, but also for experimentation and, you know, having markets that are more open here and allow these kinds of experiments that wouldn't happen elsewise. So yeah, there's certainly some competition, some of it healthy, between the jurisdictions, and the states have to participate there. But I think that getting policies that are benign and do emphasize the evolution of the market, meaning that they're not going to be heavy with ex-ante rules, particularly early in the blossoming of any particular industry or sector, are the rules that are most successful. We've seen that, and we have to remember that.
Thanks, Tom. Rob, did you want to comment?
Yes, I'll take a stab at the issue of impact on startups and the response of incumbents. And really, it's not just a matter of affecting incumbents. It's a matter, particularly on the upstream flow, of affecting secondary or tertiary related markets. So in one case, you have Snap, a company that was subject to an article in yesterday's Wall Street Journal about how they've had to make adjustments to basically get with the Facebook advertising model. But also, if you look at the secondary impact, even on incumbents, social networks and Google are substantial players in the news dissemination business, even though they don't necessarily qualify as journalists or employed journalists. So there are all kinds of antitrust implications, and you have to ask, when is it a matter of make versus buy? This is a simple, benign issue of whether a social network or a platform operator of any sort wants to buy out a potential competitor or acquire their technology versus sort of expanding their wingspan into adjacent markets. I'm not saying that you should extend your regulatory gauntlet, but understand that particularly when it comes to millennials and students and the like, they're getting their news from Google and Facebook because the platform facilitates access. And I guess the last point is that a lot of news creators have said that if we're not on Facebook's platform, if we're not searchable through Google, we don't exist. One remedy might be something that was proposed by some of the incumbent journalistic organizations who said, why don't the legislature waive a prohibition on sort of collusion or cooperative negotiation with social networks and allow the Associated Press and other major news vendors or journalistic organizations to negotiate a compensation arrangement collectively instead of individually with social networks. I'd like to ask Bob what he thought that would be.
Yeah, so Rob, thanks. That actually raises some interesting questions because, as Tom said, this is about changing business models, not only for companies, but also the way governments approach things. And your last point, I actually was going to point out that it is, I don't believe, a coincidence that there's been a drumbeat in not just the Wall Street Journal, but all of the print press owned by News Corp because of the challenges that they're facing going particularly after Google and the search model. And you talked about, everybody gets their news from Google and Facebook. Actually, they get the news from the news sources, not Google and Facebook, but rather it's the search, or that's how they find the news. And we'll just have to see whether waiving antitrust exemption for collective bargaining actually is going to be successful, because if you recall, and I know Austin Schlick is on, he might want to jump in and comment, but when Spain, imposed restrictions on Google in terms of news search, and Google said, okay, fine, we're not going to, if that's the way it is, we're not going to pay. Again, Austin, correct me if I'm wrong, and therefore we're just not going to have any links to Spanish press. The Spanish press realized that was a huge penalty for them, because people found them through search on Google, and they got the law reversed or changed. So I think this is an issue of be careful what you ask for, because it's fundamentally, as you point out, about changing business models for everybody. And the only the only thing it reminds me, not the only thing, but one of the things it reminds me of from my FCC days, Tom says he's a recovering PowerPoint user. I think of myself as a recovering regulator. But the incumbents, the existing players would always come in and say to me, if you allow these things to happen and you allow these new entrants, it's going to be the end of the world, the end of everything we know. You have to protect me, right? And the new entrants would come in and say, if you don't open up the market, we're never going to be able to get started, and it's the end of the world doesn't even begin for us. And the question is, to what extent are we seeing these very fundamental shifts in market structure, business models, and relationships with consumers being fought out in the context of regulation? The other thing I just want to point out, going to Loretta's second question about being open to innovation. I think of this in terms of conversations, frankly, that I had with people at the European Commission, and some of the U.S. Players about 2 years ago. When complaints were being raised in Brussels about the growth and the, quote, dominance of U.S. cloud providers. And I think this is going to be addressed on the last session today. And I said, so, the cloud providers, how did that happen, right? You had firms that have data centers distributed globally, and the data centers were built for their own internal use, but they recognized that there was excess capacity. Second, those data centers were connected with very, very high quality, high speed broadband networks, and they could provide distribution. And what they did was they decided that they were going to make some of their compute power in those data centers in terms of public cloud, right? This whole evolution to public cloud starting with AWS, right? There was nothing to do with regulation. Nothing to do, they just were able, they were creative. They had capacity. They thought in new ways. They thought of new business models. And at the time of this conversation, there was great, and again, Loretta and our friends in Brussels jump in, but there was great angst about there was somehow something unfair by these U.S. companies, AWS, Microsoft with Azure, Google Cloud, and others, IBM, making shared cloud, public cloud services available, which fundamentally changed compute power and the ability for startups to be able to actually, not require as much investment to do a startup because you didn't have to buy servers and run all of that yourself. And there was great angst. So my question to my colleagues in Brussels was, what prevented, so going through what those requirements were, what prevented a world-class, great European company based in Germany, SAP, from doing that? Was there any regulation? Were there any barriers? The answer, of course, is no. They just didn't think about it. So the question for our Brussels friends, as well as others on the panel, is to what extent is some of this actually about existing players wanting to catch up? To what extent, is this about wanting to use regulation to substitute for new business models, or to provide time for people to shift legacy business models when there have been innovators that have actually developed things and they've moved forward quickly? So
Bob,
I'll throw that out there. Anybody want to jump
in?
in?
Bob, can you hear me? It's Matthias.
Yes, Matthias, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you see me? I might be also part of this Brussels bubbles, and I just want to point out that besides the tax issue and the cloud issue, which you mentioned, there is a big thing about data mining and big data, which becomes a lot of relevance in the European discussion. And the issue is there really a level playing field between the OTT platforms and the classical providers in the aspect of data mining. And when it comes to regulation, there is really a different set of regulatory hurdles for classical players like telco players on GDPR, on e-privacy, and it's fairly impossible. I just had a case about that for classical providers, TV providers, to use viewing habits of their customers and to make a recommendation. Or maybe if you have seen Downton Abbey and you want to see Outlander, it's illegal, fairly illegal to do that if you would send out a recommendation to your own customer because of very high standards and very high levels of privacy, of security, and other kinds of things. On the other side, if you look to Amazon and the OTT players, Facebook and others, they constantly do that, even with European customers. If you buy a book in Amazon about horses, you immediately get the next day recommendations for other horses. And just one example, So my view would be, is this discussion on the regulatory side about a level playing field cross-Atlantic, especially on the big data issue, a relevant issue? Because I think the discussion here in Europe or in Brussels is that the usage of the customer data becomes more and more like a kind of gold mine, and that people are paying with their personal data. So they don't get the services for free. They are paying with their data, and with Alexa and all this voice generation, which is now in the market, it will even more grow. So what do you think? Is that a relevant topic for the discussion?
Yeah, I believe it is, and by the way, I would agree with you. Now, putting my Facebook hat on, we think the GDPR in Europe works. Is it perfect? No, but we think it's actually a good approach, and so we work with and within the GDPR. The problem for the traditional players is that there are additional requirements, especially on the telco side, with the e-privacy rules. And the question is, if GDPR is good for every other industry and sector within Europe, why is it not good enough for broadcasters, cable companies, telephone companies, et cetera? It should be. And we've publicly taken that position because, what we see is that what's preventing the quote level playing field, which is I think a horrible term for other reasons, which we can talk about. The reality is that many European industries in the media space and the telecom space are still regulated as though it's the 1980s and 1990s, and that they are not, and you're not, permitted to take advantage of some of the newer technologies while still protecting consumer privacy, right? That's what the GDPR is about. So I would agree with you, but again, the difference is, if you want to call it arbitrage, but you pointed out Europe versus North America. I don't think it's Europe versus North America. I think it's new entrants in Europe, the platforms or the internet companies, the digital companies, retail that are subject to GDPR, and the traditional players that are subject to something more additional beyond GDPR. So it's not.
So Bob, let me try to interject here. It's really interesting to see the dichotomy of viewpoints. I mean, I'm hearing from you that there's a kind of first mover advantage and superior business skills, build a better mousetrap, and the world will be the path to your doorway. But on the other hand, it's a little cavalier to say that Facebook or Google is just one click away from obscurity. The power, I think what I heard was that the power of data mining actually helps bolster the incumbency or the market dominance of some of the successful companies, the so-called unicorns. So I'd be curious to hear from you as to how you sort of flesh out the view that you're one click away from obscurity because of multi-homing opportunities versus the ability as a first mover to sort of bolster through acquisitions and through data mining.
so I don't think it's a, one click from obscurity. That's a nice, phrase. It's a clickbait thing, kind of like, oh my God, one click. But the reality is, if you look at, for example, search, and again, if Austin's still on, I'd urge him to jump in. But when you think about search, the reality is, when people are searching for products, they don't, the majority of the search for products is on Amazon, not Google. And so, I look at things like when you talk about multi-homing, WIC recently did a study on multi-homing and how consumers like multi-homing. A very concrete example of that is, and by the way, with the moving into the app world on a mobile platform, it's nothing more than a tap away. So when it comes to messaging and chat, WIC did this study that looked at 139 different applications. They call them rich interaction applications, RIAs. And if people don't know WIC, it's a German consultancy. They looked at 139 of these different applications. The average application had 9 functions. WeChat had something like 35 to 40 functions, adding one every 2 weeks. These are not just SMS, right? And they're not the same. So, and the drive and the need to innovate in that space and provide very different consumer uses and applications and experiences actually is what's driving the adoption. So it's very easy. I mean, and they don't, the multi-homing people like it. So I have on my phone, I have my SMS for my operator. I have Messenger. I have iMessage from Apple. I have WeChat. I have, internal chat within the work, and Viber. So people can reach me using any one of those, and they just pop up with a little icon. So so it's not necessarily, it's a false choice to say one click away from obscurity. Rather, it's about entry, and what we're seeing is absolutely there's entry, and consumers prefer choices, and they use different spaces for different parts of their lives. Work, family, friends, and they use different applications and different platforms for different things that they do. And again, I would urge you to take a look at the most recent WIC study. There were actually 2 different ones.
Yeah, Bob, this is Tom.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. There's a lot of dynamism in this marketplace, and you're certainly citing good examples. But I just want to point out that this idea that one click away from oblivion is some kind of a test for how much competition is actually in the market is a perfect example of the perfect competition prejudice. I mean, this textbook model that has very little application to what we do see or want to see in the internet space. We want firms to develop huge platforms with vast activities and investments. We want a lot to go into those platforms. We want marginal costs to be zero. And that's not perfect competition. We want firms to be constrained not by the fact that they're one click away from oblivion, but that they're 10 years to $500 billion in market equity. And that's what motivates these firms to do the next big thing. That's what the moonshots are about. That's what all of it is about. And so it is a Schumpeterian marketplace. It's not going to be perfect competition. It shouldn't be something you have to apologize or anybody else that you have invested and created through the competitive process, through in fact market selection, consumer satisfaction, a platform that will not disappear with the next click. And that's the competition we want. We want firms to go in that direction. Let me also say that, the protectionist angle is certainly something that's not specific to Europe. And in fact, we should be proud as Americans to see how much Microsoft has invested in promoting anti-Google policy in Europe and around the rest of the world. We certainly see that these kinds of you know, these kinds of political activities are strikebacks, you know, to a great extent for investments that could have been made by firms, weren't made, and now the political process is being used. We do want to be aware of those processes, and in fact, regulators need to be very much aware that they're promoting competition rather than competitors. And just lastly, I love Bob's example, thinking about the creation of the cloud and some firms coming up with an innovation business model. Just in listening to it and the excess capacity story for cloud storage, it immediately recalled that this is an old business model. This is 1960s computer time sharing. This is an idea that not only can anybody thought of, anybody who read a history book or was around in the 60s to know that this is how the computer industry made its big mark in the marketplace, is by big mainframe computers that were hooked up to have people share time. And now we're doing it with massively more intense computing power and you know, orders of magnitude more storage. But you know, these business models need to remain flexible so that we can cycle in and out. That's another great story behind the importance of flexibility in the marketplace.
Thanks, Tom. So we're coming up on the time. Is there anybody else that would like to jump in?
Pepper, this is Ellie. We had several people who on the chat function made interesting and good comments. So perhaps you want to recognize them so that they can speak to all of us.
Yeah, I was just looking at. Yeah, go ahead, Ellie. I was actually just looking at that, and so there were a number of people that had jumped in, and particularly Harry. I'm sorry, Ellie, go ahead.
Martin and Harry, for example.
Yeah, Marty.
Brian.
I was going to say Harry and Marty. So did you want to jump in? I mean, people should look at the chat window as well.
If I can, I don't know if you can even hear me.
I can see you, Harry. Go ahead.
Just wanted to say all this about how regulation might limit access to particular vendors or apps or all of that stuff, at least in the US, I think belies the fact that if we simply on the provisioning, you know, last mile level end up with one or two providers who put in data caps and there's no net neutrality, so there's favored nation access for a few large players, you know, then it doesn't matter about all that other stuff, because then there really isn't competition unless you're able, like shelf space in a store, to buy your way in.
Yeah. So thanks, Harry. So Harry's point, I think, is the sort of core net neutrality question on the actual access layer down the stack in layers 1, 2, and 3, if you will. And without that, and we were assuming we were not addressing that here. And I think the discussion was actually moving up the stack, but the lower layers do become essential. If you can't connect, you can't connect. But yeah, I appreciate that.
Can I offer this? This is Len Talley from AT&T. Yes,
please, Len.
I just want to say, fortunately, we're not going to end up with 1 or 2 ISPs in the U.S. Today, we pretty much nationwide have at least 2 wireline providers, and we all know the wireless networks are growing ever more capable. So prices are plummeting. Unlimited plans are now sort of the primary plans that are out in the marketplace, and we're moving to 5G, which is going to compete with the wireline networks without doubt, and it's going to be a video. They're going to be video networks as well. So I think, and kudos to Ellie for structuring this conference to recognize that if there were concerns about that bottleneck in the last mile in the past, that's really moved up.
Oops, I think Len froze. Hold on, we'll come back to Len.
Well, he gave me kudos, so that's a good.
Yeah, but by the way, Len's absolutely correct, and that's why the next session is actually about the middle mile, because it turns out, especially, I mean, a lot of the work that we've seen, a lot of the work being done, especially in emerging markets in the rest of the world, the bottleneck is backhaul. It's middle mile, allowing operators, competitive operators, to scale from 2G to 3G to 4G, right? And so more investment is needed to do that, and there's a whole story there. So we're going to be coming up to that. Marty, did you want to say something? Because you had some.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. A couple of things. One is I'm kind of informed by the process of competition that took place in the wireless industry in Great Britain, over the last 15 years or so, where the competition started out, in terms of, well, I don't remember the exact sequence, but it went from coverage area to handset pricing over time, and then it moved to features and functions and interconnection, and all these things didn't happen simultaneously. They happened kind of over time as the various operators rolled out their networks and expanded into the marketplace. So my comment is really driven by the idea that not all competition, as in the Chicago model, for example, are about price. And I think what we need to do as competition authorities or potential competition authorities and consultants is to understand the particular conduct in each of the segments. I think we need to be very careful about market definitions as we move up and down this stack of providers. And I don't think, frankly, that we, as a profession, have quite come to grips with that yet. Maybe I'm just out of the loop too much, but that seems to be my conclusion.
No, I think that I think that's right, because I'd love to hear from maybe just as a wrap up for the session, both Tom and Rob, to just final comments, but particularly on your point, which I think is correct, right? So why don't we move to? By the way, in chat, I would urge people to look at chat. There was a comment from Jolie around community networks and satellite and OneWeb. Rich Clark, asking about why the valuation for application providers, I don't like the term OTT, are more than the underlying network. So there's some really good stuff there, as well as the link to the WIC study that I mentioned. And thanks, Jolie, for putting that up. But if we could go back and maybe wrap up with Tom and Rob.
Yeah, well,
Rob first, or Tom?
No, Rob first.
Rob first. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity. This is really very interesting how it sort of played out. Specifically to that last point about the Chicago School and market definition, I'm working on that in a paper, and I think again going to one of my premises that the existing metrics isn't necessarily the best. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index of market share. I think you need to have a more holistic assessment of when is it a first mover who's built a better mousetrap versus used their dominance to sort of expand into secondary and tertiary markets. And market definition is a problem, but it's not necessarily just a function of quantitative calculation of market share. Very interesting to sort of hear the comments between a U.S. representative and a European representative, because I'm at this point not sure as to where the line is drawn between someone who's been a first mover and has been very successful and is moving mightily to maintain the status quo versus the sort of libertarian notion that you have a very robust and dynamic marketplace where new business models are just around the corner, and multi-billion-dollar unicorn valuations are likely also likewise to accrue to newcomers. So it's a very robust, interesting area, and lots of dichotomous viewpoints that we've assessed in a short time.
Thanks, Rob. Tom?
Yeah, well, great discussion, and it's going to be a good conference here. Just recently, I was talking to some people who are trying to understand a current U.S. merger, and they said, well, isn't there a theory about the vertical foreclosure problem? I said, oh, yeah, absolutely, there's a theory. The question is, does it apply? What are your empirical realities on this? Because there's stories every which way, and we really have to focus on theory and the empirical reality before we apply rules that are going to do more harm than good. So doing the empirics, let me just do a shout out for being also conscious of what some people, Deidre McCloskey actually has a book on this, about the tyranny of the p-value. We have to be measured, literally. We have to be conscious of what the important statistically significant findings are, and then we have to balance the different types of errors that are made, classically the type 1 and type 2 errors that Rob talked about, and suggest that people want another take from another industry on this. There's this interesting paper by an MIT economist, Andrew Lowe, on Food and Drug Administration regulation in the U.S. And you can see the power of bad analysis, bad statistical analysis in drug approvals in the United States, where we don't take into account the potential value of a new drug, and we set the same statistical error standard across markets. Now, this is just it may seem off in the weeds in a market we don't care about. Actually, it's a great marketplace. Obviously, the high-tech contributions in medicine are wonderful. But what I'm suggesting here is that in our regulatory institutions, in information technology, we have to be very cognizant of exactly the same sorts of biases and really missteps in how we apply standard empirical analysis, and it's something that really bears thinking about. So thanks very much.
No, thank you. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Rob. It's been a really good discussion. But the little hand and the big hand are converging, so our time is up, and we have another great panel looking at some of the at CDN's middle mile backhaul as an issue. So, Ellie, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yes.
And thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Pepper, for moderating this, and Tom and Rob for speaking, and all of you others to participate. We're now going into coffee break. And here's the coffee for all of you who would like to finish it. But meanwhile, we're going to move to the next panel, which is up the chain to the end of the stack to the middle mile, the CDN, for those of you from elsewhere, content delivery networks, backhaul. Those things are not quite in the public eye in the same way that net neutrality, which was alluded to also by Harry, but still kind of an issue, and not still are an issue, even though it's not particularly visible. And this will be a panel moderated by Bob again, but not Bob Pepper, but Bob Atkins. Let me just say one more thing more generally, because Washington and possibly Brussels are very attuned to nuances of who speaks and who doesn't speak, and there's kind of easy to think that there's some design in here. Let me assure you that we are not designing anything here, that we are kind of inviting good people, and some have accepted and some could not because they're traveling or speaking or teaching or whatever. So there is no particular design here except to have interesting people representing interesting perspectives. All right, with these words, Bob Atkinson, who had been the Deputy Director of CITI for a good number of years. Before that, he was also at the FCC, the Deputy Head of the Common Carrier Bureau. He was also in an entrepreneurial startup type operation in local competition, Teleport, that was acquired eventually by AT&T. And from there, Bob went to the FCC. So, Bob, please take that panel.
Thank you, Ellie. Unmute myself. Okay. All right. Am I, is my mic off? Yes, okay. First of all, the question, I know I've seen Len Calley and Bill Lair on the list of participants. I'm just wondering if David Young and Robert Cannon are either on the call-in or are they otherwise available for our conference panel?
Hey, Bob, it's David Young. I'm here.
Okay.
Bob Cannon, I can tell you, Cannon, unfortunately, from the FCC, has a health issue, and that kind of prevents me from being here today.
All right. Then our panel will consist of Bill Lair at MIT, a research associate at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT, David Young, the Vice President of Public Policy at Verizon, and Len Calley, Senior VP of Global Public Policy at AT&T. I would propose that we proceed in the order that's on the agenda. That would be Bill Lair, David Young, and Len Calley. I'm particularly interested in this topic, stuck in the middle, CDNs, backhaul, and middle mile providers, because to my ear, it's pretty much same old, same old. The question of the physical bottleneck seems to have plagued telecommunications from almost day one. Certainly, I'm not sure if it went back. It probably went back into the telegraph era. It certainly was the dominant, continuing problem of the telephone era. It was the whole reason for a Communications Act of 1934. It was the whole breakup in 1982, the divestiture, various antitrust suits and various other activities between 34 and the divestiture. After divestiture, the bottleneck was always still the big problem. We ultimately got local competition, where I was obviously personally up to my neck in the opening of the bottleneck issues. It sort of, the local bottleneck was slightly opened up in the late 80s and 90s. Local competition sort of happened, not perfectly. We ended up with a Telecom Act of 1996, which I think was very much focused on trying to either regulate the bottleneck or ideally eliminate the bottleneck. Required interconnection agreements, reciprocal compensations, and things like that. Regulation prior to the Telecom Act looked at structural remedies like open network architecture. All of these things designed to either eliminate the physical bottlenecks at local loop level, at the central office level, with varying degrees of success, probably less success than hoped for. And now the issue it seems to still be there. The name has changed. The location of the bottleneck has moved, which is quite understandable. When we first had long distance competition back in the 70s and the 80s, the bottleneck was at the local telephone network. The entire local network was the bottleneck. Once local competition started, the bottleneck moved downstream to the end office and even the local loop. And I sort of see history and technology issues, the bottleneck issue, repeating itself. Now it's moving into what we call the backhaul in the middle mile, because wireless has become more predominant than the wireline network, so the bottleneck has sort of moved. But are any of the issues fundamentally any different? And I think that is because the other thing I think we've learned is history tends to repeat itself. And if the bottleneck issue is still a major, the physical bottleneck is still a major problem, then you just look back over 100 years and you've seen that periodically, government and by legislation, regulation, or legal proceedings, it tries to either reduce that bottleneck or eliminate that bottleneck. And ultimately, the question I think for our discussion today is, is history repeating itself? Will it repeat itself? Is there a new bottleneck? And what will the inevitable, perhaps reaction B, if that bottleneck is sufficiently powerful that politicians and regulators, et cetera, get involved. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Bill Lair.
Hi, can everybody hear me? I have some slides, but I'm not sure how to show those, and if I can't, that's fine. It's certainly a pleasure to be here, and I really enjoyed the first part of the discussion. What I'm going to be talking about today, because I didn't have a great idea as to what all folks will be talking about. I've been drawing on 3 different papers that I've worked on recently. One is a paper that talks about Communications Act 2021 that basically looks at a way to rethink how we might think about communications policy, what the appropriate scope is, and what the issues are. And I'll come back to some of the points I raised in that paper. Another one that I'll start off with is a paper that I wrote with a number of co-authors on the growing complexity of content delivery networks, and we're just sort of looking at a little bit of level setting. Looks like I have my slides here. Am I in control of them? No. Wait. Am I in control of these slides?
Probably.
All right. Yeah, okay. So then the third paper is, would you like your internet with or without video? That all these papers are written with co-authors, and some of the other comments are going to draw on other work that I'm involved with. We have a number of projects looking at trying to measure different things within the internet. And a lot of this is joint work with folks out at UC San Diego, CADA, on doing different sorts of performance measurement, including congestion measurements. So let me start with just some high-level comments, because I thought Henning was going to be on this talk, and I'm not sure how much is going to be covered by other folks. But when you go out there and you look at sort of what's happened to the internet, and you say, what are we seeing and why would interconnection be changing? We're still seeing the double-digit traffic growth, and because the traffic's growing so fast, 24% compound annual growth rate, which is what Cisco's projecting in their latest VNI. You got to remember, that's on a monstrous base, and it's faster in a lot of different segments. It's faster at the peak, and it's getting much more concentrated. So most of the big providers are saying if there was, let's say, 20 or 50 providers that accounted for 50% or 75% of their traffic a number of years ago, today it's a much smaller number of providers accounting for a much larger share of their traffic. And most of this is entertainment video. The real monsters out there are Netflix, YouTube, streaming on other platforms. And so one of the immediate questions you'd ask yourself is the capacity scaling? Are we seeing huge congestion bottlenecks? And what's happening to address those? And one of the first points you look at is you basically say, why would you have CDNs? And there was a great, okay, my slide's not moving. Okay, this was a slide. Jeff Houston's talked about this, who's very much involved in the internet community. And back in 2011, there was a slide at the NANO conference that was showing, what it looked like in terms of round-trip delays. If you were trying to access content, there was mostly at that time on servers in the U.S. Anywhere else in the world, you can see most of the world is red, because if you're pulling the content to the users, and the content is basically the content is basically cacheable, not real time. You want to cache it close to the users. And so that's actually what's happening, and that's really driving a lot of what goes on in CDNs. You don't want to pay for that transit business, and you don't want to pay for the performance costs of not having that content close to you. So the CDNs make a lot of sense, and one of the things we're seeing the rise of these, and they've been a significant part of how we've addressed these problems. The CDNs are locating much closer to the edge networks, and they're delivering most of the traffic into these edge networks. And so that's where a lot of the sort of tussle issues come up with. When we talk about the CDNs and whether or not the CDNs need to get regulated or is there a problem here, I think we need to recognize that there's lots and lots of ways to deliver the content. There's lots of providers offering the different services. And in the paper, we talked about 8 different classes and types of CDNs and examples of them, ranging from much more centralized to distributed to specialized, et cetera. And there's a whole ecosystem that content providers can take advantage of. So if you're really small or free, or you want to distribute content for free, and you're the new artist, or you want to get your ideas out there on the internet, the general purpose internet provides a lot of opportunities to do that. And if you're not willing to pay for it, and it's free, and that's not a bad option, and that works for a lot of people in a lot of situations. When you get medium to large size, then you need CDN service providers. There's a lot of those. The one that's the best known, I think, is Akamai, and Akamai provides all sorts of CDN architectures and services on a broad basis. But if you get really large, then even someone like Akamai really doesn't want to deal with you, and it makes sense to self-provision. So when you get to be someone like Google size with YouTube, or Facebook, or Netflix, it makes sense for you to start thinking about how you're going to self-provision and build your own CDN and build your own sort of content. So I think all of this is a logical development in the marketplace. And that there are also obvious and growing synergistic benefits from integrating ISPs and CDNs much more closely. And we're seeing this. And this potentially should worry people because, it's changed the nature of what we thought we were regulating traditional ISPs. I think a lot of the discussion in the earlier session highlighted the fact that the markets are moving so fast. We've got this problem of our old models and the people that were identifying those old models being subject to regulations that don't seem fair when they're competing with the guys that are in the new models, but we're not sure if the new models are adequate to address all the new problems. And I think those are really valid issues that we need to be aware of. So one of the things that we wrote in the Communications 2021 paper that focused on was the idea there was, what should communications policy be? I think everybody recognizes the traditional telecoms regulation is no longer the model that we would like to have today. And there's a huge number of issues that we've touched on today that I don't think are communications policy, or communications policy regulatory authorities by themselves can't deal with. Things like, the tax issues we talked about, fake news. So I think when you think about what is communications policy and what would be the role of, let's say, an FCC or a regulatory authority that was the sort of mirror image of an FCC elsewhere, is it would be to focus on what we think the new PSTN is. And in our paper we talk about, so there are really two. There's this sort of last mile broadband platform, which I think everybody's talking about, and then this idea of sort of an open internet. In both cases, I think increasingly we have to deal with the fact that the only thing that's really going to work is much more market-based regulation, and that when we talk about market-based regulation, and let's focus on, because basically, if you talk about a bottleneck, and there is a bottleneck, and we talk about it being the last mile, you're going to end up with some sort of open access type of framework, because the goal is to get the industry to share the bottleneck. If you think, like Len Talley suggested earlier, that basically there's lots of competition and it's not really anymore a bottleneck, then the legacy rules of essential stuff, regulation of that may just be a bad idea. But, if you go forward, what would be the competitive parts? And the competitive parts, I think you need to first understand that you have to have some general rules of the road, and you have to tolerate a lot of tussle. So when you talk about something like interconnection, and you look at what's happening, the concentration of the traffic, you have to recognize that a lot of the upstream providers, the Netflix, the Googles of the world, they have a lot of bargaining power when they're negotiating interconnection agreements. And if you don't want to regulate them, and I don't think you do right now, you don't think we know exactly how to do that, you're going to have to allow some tussle, but you're going to need to have an enforcement capability, and you're going to need to have data. And a lot of the stuff that we'd like to know, we just don't know. So, for example, the stuff that we're doing about measurement is working on techniques that are very imperfect at this point. And when we talk about things like one of the reasons people are interested in transit and other options like internet exchanges is because if you're worried about how these interconnection agreements are being negotiated in smoke-filled rooms, if transit is available because the prices are pretty, they're observable, they've been falling, that it's an alternative to peering, and it sets a cap on what kind of mischief you think might be happening. But if transit's going away and it's being replaced by CDNs, Well, that's sort of a natural development of the market, but it's not clear from the data that's available whether or not the transit, it's as a business model and a way to fund the investment, it's clearly not able to do that. It's unclear how much of an option it exists. We don't really know how much traffic is actually on transit sort of generally. And then with the things like IXPs, there's this debate about, well, the problem in the U.S. is that, the U.S. doesn't have enough IXPs, and we just had IXPs where anybody can interconnect like they do in Europe. That would work great. I think that's an argument that needs to be looked at much more closely because the models of interconnection in the U.S. are very different. And then if we talk about sort of some of the other questions that are coming up, like what are other future bottlenecks, and a lot of this is going to be things that I think we may touch on in the next panel. Some of the things that would worry me, but I don't think it's yet time to say they need regulation, we ought to be thinking about it, are things like cloud interconnection and platform portability. Because the way the market's evolving into these curated platforms, like Tom Hazlett said, if all of that's entertainment, I don't really have a problem with it because that's the way entertainment business wants to work, and a lot of that's what that's about. If it's critical services and that we need for sort of the future of the internet, then I want to think a little bit more carefully about that, but I'm not seeing that as being threatened. And I think I'm out of my 10 minutes, so let me stop there.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's interesting, as you were speaking, I was thinking that actually the topic is bifurcated. There's physical bottlenecks, which perhaps we'll hear about a little bit more, literally the wires, the fibers to the cell sites and backhaul facilities and things like that. And then you have the content bottlenecks, which might be solved or addressed by CDNs and things like that. I would guess that our next two speakers, both from Verizon and AT&T, since they have both the physical facilities as well as some content, might have either some interesting views, hopefully consistent, but we'll see. I guess I'd invite David Young from Verizon to join the conversation. David.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bob. And I think we will be getting into the physical network pieces of it next. At least that's where I'm planning to take the discussion. So we've already heard and talked about Glenn mentioned this earlier. The has transformed the U.S. with broadband speeds available to mobile devices from 4 nationwide carriers throughout most of the United States. And so people have true broadband connectivity almost wherever they go. And even in their homes, when they're connecting to Wi-Fi and wireline broadband connections, they are still often using wireless devices connecting through their Wi-Fi. So this transition to mobility is well underway and will only continue. But what has happened as a result of this is that networks have had to make incredible investments to keep up with the ever-increasing demand and the speeds that customers are getting through their mobile devices, which has caused a great demand for fiber. And before smartphones were ubiquitous, much of the backhaul was on traditional TDM, DS1, DS3 type connections. Today, it's almost all fiber in order to meet the, to be able to deliver the 4G speeds that people have come to expect. And so that transition from the legacy TDM circuits to fiber has led to quite an explosion in investment in the fiber middle mile networks. And we've seen companies like Zayo, who currently have 124,000 route miles in the U.S., about 10.5 million fiber miles, stepping in as third-party dark fiber providers in order to meet this ever-growing demand from the mobile providers. One of the benefits of that is that the availability of that middle mile fiber is providing benefits to other entities as well. So, you know, for other broadband providers, you know, non-wireless broadband providers have been lacking some of that, and of course for enterprise connectivity, that obviously will be more plentiful. So I think that the middle mile bottleneck, if you will, is actually not a problem. It's one that's being solved by marketplace and investment. You know, the third-party fiber providers, as well as, you know, companies building their own fiber, of course, and you know, the ever-increasing capacity. Where I do think there is, you know, maybe not a bottleneck, but, you know, still a problem, if you will, is the, you know, when you get to the local networks, you know, as the capacity that consumers are using on their mobile devices increases, you know, the additional capacity needs to be added to the network. There's not unlimited spectrum available, and so the solution to that problem is with densified networks. You know, many more antennas serving much smaller geographic areas, and you know, this is the small cell, which is currently being deployed, you know, in cities throughout the country in order to provide the depth of capacity that's required to meet the demand in these markets. And so here the problem is getting fiber to these small cells. So it's not a backhaul problem, if you will, it's a front haul problem. And so you know, that's the solution that needs to come into place now is bringing dense fiber infrastructure, you know, to these markets in order to meet the needs of you know, the small cells, and in order to provide service to these small cells. And I think similarly, you know, in a similar way that the fiber in the backhaul has led to benefits more broadly because of its availability, I think that, you know, these dense local fiber networks that are going to be deployed in order to support mobility will also provide benefits because of their availability for you know, direct connection to businesses and to even to homes. So I think you know, that. So my takeaway on this is that, you know, I don't think that we're really seeing significant bottlenecks in the physical infrastructure, at least in the U.S., and that those trends are likely to continue. I don't see any end in sight for them, but you know, perhaps my compatriot from AT&T who will be following me has a different perspective on that, and so I will turn it over to him so we can continue on with the discussion.
Len, take it away. Len Calley at AT&T. Turn on your mic.
Use of the video. I know you've been streaming for a long time, but this is a great and convenient way to host the symposium, so thank you for that. All right, so, you know, as Bob knows, I've been doing this for 29 years. I joined AT&T shortly after the breakup when we were trying to drive competition into the long-haul network, and right through the 96 Act and beyond, where we sort of pushed through, both as a regulatory policy matter, but also through technology to eliminate the bottlenecks that existed. And I think the good news here today, and my primary point is, we don't see bottlenecks in the network any longer. It's certainly not we're not stuck in the middle. Whether it's CDN's backhaul in the middle mile, I don't believe there are any bottlenecks. The market is working, and the proof is in the pudding. And I say the proof is in the pudding because IP network evolution and the internet has grown and changed, and it continues to grow and change unimpeded by any middle mile bottlenecks. You know, if you look at it, the middle mile, the IP access as well as the middle mile and the backbone have accommodated enormous growth and change in the ecosystem with ever lower prices. As Bill was pointing out, the prices are going to continue to decline, and quality and resiliency continue to improve. I mean, just look in terms of sheer growth, the amount of data moving across the networks continues to accelerate. So the average hour traffic on AT&T's network this year is growing at an annual rate of close to 50%. Cisco estimates that busy hour traffic is growing about 1.5 times as fast as average hour. And of course, we have to scale our networks to accommodate the busy hour. And on top of the growth in demand, the nature of the traffic is changing. So about 70% of all traffic today is now video, and the video is growing rapidly. And the fact that so much video is moving to over-the-top delivery confirms that the networks are capable and that they are operating at prices and quality that the market is demanding. This doesn't mean that the way we're delivering a lot of this traffic is not changing. I think Bill outlined some of the changes taking place, and that's not surprising. Video not only generates large amounts of data, it's overwhelmingly, at least today, unidirectional and it's highly peaked. So these traditional transit arrangements aren't well suited to this type of traffic, both from the perspective of the sender as well as the receiver. And the middle mile transport has adapted, as you would expect in a well-functioning market. More than half of all traffic today is delivered by way of content delivery networks, as Bill was talking about, that transmit content from among regionally dispersed data centers where it's cached regionally, closer to end users, and competitive CDN providers like Akamai, Limelight, even Level 3, make these services available to content providers on a competitive basis. In addition, some of the content providers, the larger ones like Netflix, Google, and Amazon, have deployed their own CDNs. And to get a sense of the momentum here, you just have to look at the Cisco stats. So they show, Bill was saying, the 24% CAGR in growth in the exabytes of traffic moving across the internet. I had a number of 26% from 2016 to 2021. During the same period, the share of traffic represented by CDNs is expected to grow from 52% in 2016 to 71% in 2021. So, of course, commensurately, the share of traffic represented by non-CDN traffic will decline from 48% in 2016 to 29% in 2021. But it's important to note that this doesn't mean that internet traffic of either type is going to decline in absolute terms or that transit is going to go away. Cisco's projecting healthy growth for both CDN and non-CDN traffic. It's just that traffic utilizing CDNs will grow more quickly. And when you look at it, this looks like a healthy market response to the changing nature of the traffic and the efficiencies inherent in each type of transport and delivery architecture. So in my mind, it confirms we have no bottlenecks here. The technical measures may not be accurate, as Bill was saying, but we have the proof in the pudding. In addition, the enormous concentration in the source of the video traffic probably helps explain a lot of the move to CDN. Nearly 60% of total traffic at peak period in the US and Canada is generated by just 3 companies, Netflix, Google, and Amazon. So it's not surprising that these companies would prefer not to use less efficient transit arrangements when they have other options, including building their own CDNs and directly connecting in more direct ways to ISPs. So the takeaways from this, at least my takeaways, are the networks remain healthy and are continuing to invest to accommodate growth and change in consumer demand. Speeds and capacity in access, middle, and backbone networks continue to rise briskly. Prices continue to decline. And new interconnection arrangements are being struck, and the arrangements are being implemented to accommodate the changes in customer demand. So in short, when you look at the market as a whole, you have dynamism and innovation, you have improving quality and declining prices, and all these things are confirmation that they don't appear to be bottlenecks, either current or emerging. I think the markets are flexible and can address it. I take David's point, which I think is well placed, that in the access networks now we're implementing dense fiber infrastructures. There may be concerns there with access to rights of way and access to poles and the like. I think the industry is working that with the local governments. But in the networks themselves, we're not seeing these bottlenecks. At least that's the perspective I wanted to bring to the table. It's repeat some of what Bill said and what David said, but I'd like to thank you and open it to questions, if that's next, Bob.
Can
I just make a few quickie clarifications? This is Bill.
Yeah, Bill, go right ahead. I was going to ask.
Yeah. So I agree with both what David and Len did about the question about the physical bottlenecks, and certainly as that applies to the U.S. Bob Pepper earlier made the point about that isn't as true around the world, and I think, like, for example, when you look at like mobile providers in much of the developing world that would like to basically expand their connectivity to the rest of the world, do face problems. And in many cases, I think those are regulatory problems, and maybe we'll hear from a bunch of the other folks online about that. When most of my comments, when I talked about a bottleneck, I was thinking about it as an economic bottleneck, and how you want to define that. I think you can go all the way from the notion of sort of an essential facilities type of doctrine to something much more, industry, policy thing. And I think that's a debate we need to have in this country. Generally, I think that part of what I was saying was that when you do decide there is a bottleneck, and I think the last mile is something we will still debate for a number of years about whether it is or isn't a bottleneck, and all this fiber needs to go in for dense cells in the U.S. and elsewhere. That's a debate we can have. I think that we need to recognize that if we do regulate that, that's going to cause a lot of problems that are going to make it hard for us not to be like public utilities, and that that's just something we may have to live with. If we're talking about upstream, we need to think about how we would address the problems, to deal with what Ellie did when he launched the discussion initially and said, if we have an oligopoly, that probably is the industry structure that makes the most sense, and often oligopolies do a great job and are very, very competitive. But if they're not, and if there's a problem, we need to be able to have regulatory interventions, and the key to doing that is going to be able to understand having a healthy ecosystem to basically raise red flags timely enough, and to know and to have these discussions, and figuring out things like what are the right markets and all of that. These are really hard questions. There's a lot of research needed in this area. I think a lot of people on this call are involved in that. Let me stop.
So in terms of an economic bottleneck, I think that what we're seeing as we try to build out these dense wireless networks and dense fiber networks is the bottleneck is actually moving to the rights of way and to the poles and conduits. It's sort of the layer zero, what the infrastructure needs to be attached to or run through or put on. And so, the local governments that control that are perhaps the last monopoly.
Thank you. I've been observing some of the chat where there seems to be some individuals on the call seems to have some different views, or wonder whether there is no bottleneck problem, if that's perhaps overstating the case. So I would first like to invite any questions or comments that would support the idea that there is a bottleneck problem in some fashion, so that we can have a full scope of is there a problem or isn't there. So anyone who would like to take the floor and suggest that there is a significant bottleneck problem, please speak up. And if there isn't, of course, we can stop the discussion almost. Declare victory.
Well, this is Bill. Just quickly, I think when you think about the regulatory thing, I think we need to have a regulatory framework that allows us to ask that question, and we can produce different sorts of evidence. I'm not willing to say there are no bottlenecks. What I've seen is certainly in like interconnection. I see no pressing need to regulate interconnection, in the backbone or upstream today.
Here's Matthias speaking. Bob?
Yes.
Yes. I'm a little bit surprised. Everybody thinks we are fine, and obviously there is no regulation on this level. And there are only some cases, I think, cross-border, where some parties try to get regulatory intervention on the European Commission, but those cases have been settled. But what I heard in the past is that there was a blacklist, especially from Netflix and others, who are blackmailing in a kind of a blacklist, that there are bottlenecks, and there was also, I think it was maybe a time ago, a kind of suspicion that the traffic is routed out of specific reasons to create bottlenecks, because some of you mentioned that only 3 big providers are causing most 90% of the traffic, and especially in peak time, there have been some causes. I'm not aware that, especially when there is a peak time event where everybody is watching, and in those times, some of the providers routed the traffic in the purpose to create a bottleneck. Maybe that's rumors, and it's gone away, but I would like to hear if there was still something around in this direction.
Anyone want to follow up on that?
Well, I mean, this is Bill. Part of what I was saying to the market is I've certainly heard those stories. One of the things that used to be the case, and this is, again, sort of looking on the outside, trying to understand what goes on amongst the providers, is that, they used to provision capacity when, in a sort of regular way, when they saw utilization creeping up. The CDNs have gotten so good at controlling how traffic gets injected into a network that they can run circuits extremely hot and not drop any traffic. Now, at the same time, they can also control the routing and cause pain for each other. And these are things that everybody, they all kind of know how to do. And a certain amount of that is what you'd expect in any kind of market where people are negotiating. And the question is, there have been certain examples, like in the U.S., there were some tracked examples, and we have measurements that can actually document that. But, you didn't have to look hard because both sides were saying that this was a problem. Netflix and Comcast were arguing about this publicly. That happens. But the question is, if you want the market to operate, you're going to have to tolerate that, and that's not a problem. So the question is it systematically causing harm to consumers' experience in ways that would require industry regulators to intervene, or can industry deal with this? And I think the question is a little bit different if you're talking about someone who's delivering paid content like a Netflix than potentially if you're dealing with someone that's advertising supported. But ultimately, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that's more of a detail, and that comes in from the economic theory of, do they have another instrument to basically negotiate around these sorts of problems?
And this is Len. I would like to build on what Bill said, because I think the market can handle it. But the allegation, and this is the danger of regulation, right? The allegation was that somehow the ISP, the network provider, had the power here. And I think what Matthias is getting to is well worth recognizing. This is IP traffic. And the ISPs are interconnecting with, say more than a dozen, a couple of dozen of different providers, whether it's peering arrangements, transit arrangements, or otherwise. And the content providers, particularly the large content providers, were easily able to whipsaw the ISPs by moving traffic among these transit networks. And as Bill points out, they are very adept at running their circuits very hot without disrupting, without damaging the traffic. But that is not what I would consider a bottleneck, because when you use the term bottleneck, it almost implies we need regulatory intervention at this point. The point I wanted to make was the regulatory argument, because of the historical nature of telecoms being regulated by government. The argument was you need to regulate the telecoms more, and it was an effort to use the regulatory environment to basically get free access to networks. The reality is all players here have an ability to negotiate and work through these issues. But to Matthias's point, I think it's worth recognizing content providers have myriad mechanisms to deliver the traffic, and they have the technical capability to move their traffic very quickly among different providers and reach the end user regardless of what the ISP's view is on all that, because the ISP is connected to multiple transit providers and peering customers as well as CDNs.
Do I have anybody in the conference that would like to allege or alleges that there actually is a bottleneck problem of at least the scope that, as Len points out, that it implies the need for regulatory intervention, as opposed to a bottleneck that I think Bill and others mentioned, which a less of a bottleneck where there is a market or a technology workaround, so that the bottleneck doesn't reach the level of truly impairing competition, which I guess is the ultimate, one of the ultimate tests is competition advanced or retarded, and technology advanced or retarded because of the power of a bottleneck somewhere on the stream. So, so anyone who wants to allege a serious bottleneck.
Yeah, I don't know one to necessarily allege a serious bottleneck, but I'd like to bring up the idea that we dealt with the last mile problem on a regulatory basis with the essential facilities doctrine, and that was okay for dealing with a physical bottleneck like the last mile and the call termination issues in the telephone world. But I think we need to distinguish between that and somebody simply squelching throughput, putting their foot on the air hose as a behavioral issue rather than the last mile issue, which was much more of a structural and physical bottleneck. I'm not sure where the bottlenecks are in this new world. I understand the idea that you want to manage your traffic, and sometimes that can squelch down throughput, but I don't necessarily agree that that would meet the standards of an essential facility that demands the regulatory intervention, as opposed to the idea that it's simply a lack of capacity investment and on the part of the provider, and therefore they are managing their network in that way. So that's all for me.
Bill, two things. I think there's a good part of this question about if someone's stomping on the air hose. Some of that's what happens potentially in negotiations, and that's what you happen with a market. And the question about who should be investing in the capacity isn't always clear. When you drop a whole lot more content into a network, there are things they have to do, and the question is who, should payments flow from those content providers to basically pay for that. And I think that is something that we ought to consider more seriously, because it's not obvious to me that there shouldn't be some payment there. On the other hand, the question is, even if we don't have a bottleneck, I absolutely believe we ought to have a regulatory capability, because both sides are capable of having mischief, and if either side is abusing this. So if I've caught someone stomping on the hose and causing serious harm to consumers and able to really abuse their market power in that way, I would hope that the regulators would step in and say, okay, that's not good. That's that's a problem. And so the fact that we have a regulator does not necessarily mean the regulator actually does anything. In the best world, the regulator is just capable, but can sit on the fence and watch the market go, and everything works.
Do we have such a regulator today?
Regulators don't do that. Regulators have to flex their muscles. That's how they get paid.
Okay. Bill, your one point you mentioned, at least just a second ago, which I thought was important, was to distinguish between the consumer being screwed or having the air hose stepped onto the consumer, so the consumer is hurt, versus the air hose perhaps being stomped onto another major player in the ecosystem. In other words, is there a difference in considering the existence of a bottleneck and what the appropriate response is, as to whether it is the theoretically powerless or end user consumer, the citizen, versus just some multi-billion-dollar corporation? Does that make a difference to how regulators should sit on the fence and observe what's happening? Should they be regulating only on behalf of the end user, or other major corporations who are involved in the process?
Well, I mean, from my view, I think when one talks about like the bottleneck, the last mile, we have to ask ourselves, do we have the right kind of infrastructure out there, and what's the way to manage it? And that involves so many of the discussions, and I've tried not to focus too much on that part of it. But if we talk about the other part, sort of like the open internet, you have to ask yourself, what's the open internet really for? And what do we really care? Where's the economic growth that's going to come from that? And why should we care? If it's all entertainment, and it's just playing there, that's a business where, the less regulation, I think, for the most part, the better, because that's a business that works pretty damn well. If it's smart X, sort of having all this connectivity, we may need to worry about it, but we have the problem may be more a question of, the bad things that come from sort of the entertainment eating the internet, and thinking about what we need to have like an open internet. Right now, we have a pretty good open internet for those things. It's not clear that, for example, the growth of things like Internet of Things or smart cars or cloud computing is right now seriously hampered by the internet. And I guess we'll hear more about that in the next session. But with respect to the entertainment, today I'm a little irritated when I go over, that I cut my Comcast subscription, and now I have to separately subscribe to Hulu and Netflix and HBO if I want to have the full slate of programs. But you know what? That's not really a problem. I mean, if I want all those, I'll pay for all of them, and I can get them, and I get competition amongst them, and all of those I can get into my house. So I don't really see a problem with that. And if I'm talking about bizarre, like the bizarre, new, innovative content, there's lots of options for those guys to get that content to me too. So I don't really see a problem there that requires, serious regulatory intervention. I do think going forward we have some issues, and like if you think about like a bottleneck that we've dealt with in a totally different way is intellectual property. I mean, intellectual property, we've created a whole framework to deal with the fact that we create a bottleneck and then we create a framework for making people have access to that bottleneck. In the future of the internet, we talk about things like interoperability, and you think about the content, there may be issues about how we interconnect metadata and things like that that could be an issue. And some of these things are coming up in the detailed discussions about bottlenecks and things like search, or bottlenecks and some of this stuff about big data access. There are issues there that I think we ought to be thinking about, to potentially be concerned about. And in some ways, I think there you want to have a regulatory playing field that is at the right level. So like, for example, with privacy regulations, I don't think privacy regulations should primarily live at the level of communications policy, because I think the relevance of how we manage data is economy-wide. So we need a framework for that. And then ask yourself how that applies to communications.
That's right. This is Len again, if I may. I just wanted to touch on the air hose and the idea of a regulated monitor. The idea that somebody could squelch down the air hose, this is where the competition in broadband sold to consumers is really important, because if service degrades, the network gets blamed. And as long as consumers have options, no network provider has any interest in degrading service. And I think on the transit side as well, those transit providers, they're all competing with each other to pick up the business and carry it to the ISPs, and they're not looking to degrade service. So yeah, competition could be messy, negotiations could be messy, but as I go back to the proof is in the pudding and the market's working, we should trust the market. In terms of having a regulator who could monitor, that never sounds bad. But coming out of a communications company, you have a little history behind it and you worry. So we see in 2015, the FCC twisted its regulations into a pretzel so it could regulate the carrier side of interconnection, but make very clear it wasn't regulating any of the other companies that were involved in interconnection. And I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Bill, but I think what you're saying is, look, we have to look at these issues on an ecosystem-wide or industry-wide basis. If we have public policy concerns with things like privacy, we should figure out what those policy concerns are and how to apply them in a consistent fashion so consumers are really protected across the ecosystem. But given the evolution of the networks and the growth of competition with time, it is time to leave behind this notion that the communications companies are somehow unique or different and should be subject to one set of regulations or a regulator that monitors them uniquely, unless you find a durable, robust, sustained market power someplace. And we don't see that today. The market's working. We just have to be mindful of that. So It's not that maybe you don't want, obviously you do want government policy, you want policy frameworks that ensure consumers are protected, but they should no longer be uniquely focused on the network providers.
Len, is that a way of saying that regulators should just focus really on the consumer and not the relationships between the fairly large players in the whole internet ecosystem?
Yeah, and I think it is. And I think the reason, that always sounds, you always say, hey, the world of absolutes, but the problem you have is when the regulators try to balance issues among the large players who are working things out, either they mistakenly, inadvertently, or intentionally pick winners and losers. And I think we saw a lot of that in the past where decisions were made in ways that skew the playing field, and then that inevitably hurts consumers downstream because you're not allowing an efficient market to operate. Whereas if you focus on the consumer and say, what's in the best interest of this consumer, or are consumers being harmed, there's less opportunity and less risk that the regulator is going to pick winners and losers, maybe for innocent reasons or good reasons, or maybe not so good reasons and not so innocent reasons.
Ellie, I understand you would like to interject. Turn your microphone on. Ellie, you need to turn it.
Here I am. My apologies. Question. Looking forward, the growth rates that we are observing of traffic are enormous. And so how do these providers of the middle mile keep up with that? Can you possibly, since there are two people here from the industry, tell us what is involved by way of investment, or what share of your investments go into that segment, and how long does it take to upgrade, let's say, double the capacity or 25% growth rate of the capacity? Can you give us a little sense of how network providers can keep up with traffic growth? Because maybe there's no bottleneck today, but that doesn't mean there won't be one tomorrow.
So I'll jump in if you don't mind. Again, today I don't see the bottleneck for us primarily being in the middle mile. It's really in the final mile and even the final hundreds of feet. It's building out the fiber to those small cells and getting those small cells placed in the public rights of way, on poles, on lampposts, and those sorts of things. And so they're the biggest, and that is very expensive to do, of course. But the challenges that we're finding have to do with dealing with the local regulators who control access to that municipal infrastructure, the rights of way, and the municipal infrastructure that we'd be attaching to, and so in some cases they don't allow wireless. It's not a permitted use in the right of way. In other cases, there can be very lengthy delays in approvals. In other cases, we see cities that see this as a financial gold mine, and they're looking to charge outrageous rates to place small cells in the public rights of way. So those are the types of bottlenecks that we're struggling with in order to deploy the capacity that's going to be required going forward in order to deliver multi-gigabit mobile connections.
And if I could add to what David said, so AT&T is the largest single investor in the United States of any public company. The figures are staggering. I think over the last 5 years, the number's around $135 billion, more than $20 billion a year. And this has been the case year after year after year. AT&T has been investing in its networks in the United States and globally. But the preponderance of that, of course, is the U.S. And the drivers of that investment, tax policy is going to be relevant, spectrum policy is going to be relevant, and of course regulatory policy, including the siting issues that David was mentioning. So I can't, Ellie, I don't have the numbers in front of me about how long it takes us to upgrade a particular part of the network, or what's our share of investment in middle mile versus long haul versus access. But what you can be sure of, there's no other public company in the U.S. investing more than AT&T today. And I think the second or third investor, David would know, is Verizon.
Yeah,
the broadband industry is investing enormous sums, and it's going to continue to invest enormous sums But we do have to be mindful that those three policy areas I touched on, tax, spectrum, and regulatory, affect the ability of these companies, our companies, to meet the demand and the growth we're seeing. You know, ideally, and the markets, again, I go back to the proof is in the pudding, we've been meeting those challenges today. I have every expectation we'll meet them going forward.
You know, Mike, I totally agree with sort of what both David and Len said. I don't think there's a challenge, certainly. I think most of the investment that we need to make is going to be in the small cells and fiber in the U.S. Obviously, when you get in the developing world, there's lots of places where you need investment at every level, and you can't take for granted that you have a lot of long-haul fiber available. In the U.S. and most of the developed places, you do have a lot of that long-haul fiber, and it's really easy to scale that cost-wise if there aren't other problems with using that. And the question about whether or not we should care only about consumers or other parts of the business, I think we should certainly care about, you know, both consumers and their experience, and we should care about innovation and making sure that the essential facilities, things like rights of way and the things that we believe really are scarce in building this out, like the outside structures, that those are open to innovators. I think that the focus of the regulatory models is on making sure the wholesale markets work. So, you know, it's not thinking about directly impacting the user experience, but trying to make sure that the industry is structured so that they don't, and when they're tussling amongst themselves, they don't leave the end user consumers as roadkill, and that the consumers can get the kind of services they need. And I think an important part there is that the option for end users to self-provision and build out their own networks, I mean, I think that's going to be one of the most interesting kind of ways in which, in the developed markets, consumers will be able to respond. So making sure that stays open and people can do that. So the battle between Wi-Fi style networks and mobiles is a good battle, and one that I hope continues.
All right, we are approaching the end of our allotted time. There's probably only time for one more question or comment. So anyone want to jump in? And if not, it'll give us 4 minutes to go get coffee, et cetera, before the next panel begins. So I'd like to thank Bill, David, and Len for handling this topic and giving us an insight into the presence or absence of bottlenecks of varying degrees. And well, I guess the answer I take away from this is it's something we need to keep our eye on constantly, but no immediate radical action required on bottlenecks, which I guess is about the best we can hope for. Thank you. Next panelist, I'll hand it back to Ellie or Jason.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the previous panel, Bob and Bill and David and Len, very much for enlightening us. On this particular panel, I kind of have somewhat of a triple role. First, I'm introducing the moderator, and then I'm also speaking. I guess that's two. All right. Let me introduce, as the moderator, Ona Hulderwijn, and it gives me great pleasure to do so because she had been in the role that Jason Buckwhite has today, namely the Deputy Director, Associate Director, running the show in many ways. That was at Columbia following a stint at the Annenberg School of Communication.
Forget it. It's okay, Ali.
All right. Okay, and then, subsequent to this, was
time for some fun.
And at Barclays, and so now she is, and she's been writing extensively. So now she is here back at CITI, at least virtually, moderating this panel. So, Ona, take it away.
You bet. Well, listen, it's fabulous to catch up. I've been sort of immersed in financial market stuff for years, so it's always great to come back to Columbia, and you're always at the front of the wave, you know?
And so far, this panel is brilliant. So I have a few little facts and figures about market power, to which subject we now turn. I'll bring those in after, well, just, in case no one else knew these things. I only just saw them last night. But anyway, this panel is video cloud platforms, market power, reality, and remedy. And to get matters going, we have Howard Humanoff, who's Senior Vice President at MediaLink, and former, really important at PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, in their global entertainment, media, and communications advisory practice. He's had several policy and consulting roles, and currently produces Media Reporter, produced in conjunction with Columbia, CITI. So that sounds fascinating. I didn't realize that that was happening. Anyway, Howard, maybe you could show us or take it away.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? So I have my the microphone working properly?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay, great. So I think that there've been the discussions before this, and maybe I'll just give some context for folks who don't know me, and hello to those of you who my CITI friends. So my background is really a career focused on, no matter who it is I'm particularly working for at the moment, around the production, distribution, monetization of content, and obviously that increasingly is a world in which that all takes place on digital platforms, or increasingly, certainly the growth is in digital platforms, and the job or challenge for legacy media companies is kind of maintaining the existing ecosystem while pivoting and growing successfully in a digital environment. I think that a couple of things that I think Bill actually in the last session spoke to that I thought are very applicable when you think about market power, which is sort of what is the system that we're talking about? Who are we trying to protect? And what might we want or need to do about it, and what are the implications if we do something? And I'm speaking sort of regulatory, governmental intervention. And I think that the constituencies to protect here, in a sense, are the consumer. We can talk about how and to what extent they need protection or protect, concern, and then the creative community. And I say this because we have an interest beyond simple economics, I think, and that's why we have a Communications Act as opposed to simply something that's regulated by the FTC or by the Justice Department, which is continuing to enhance a system of creativity, innovation, in not simply entertainment, but the creation, distribution, dissemination of information that is central to our entire our democracy. We can debate how well that's working and the challenges we're all going through now, but if we accept that as an underlying notion, I think the question is to what extent, as you get into a system in which the cloud is a dominant form in which people access their content, their information, what does that mean, and what should we do about that? And I think that though as I look at it as from the content production, distribution, and consumption sides, recognize that this is an area that we're still at a very early stage. I mean, we are still, at really an incredibly kind of nascent stage of what it means for the great machinery of content production, distribution, and monetization be taking place, sort of, and access through the cloud. That the market power in this world is, to understand market power, you sort of have to understand, I think, why is it, what is the value that consumers need when it comes to the access of the content, and what is it that most drives them? And it is, I would call it kind of softer benefits as opposed to those of a hard wire, the stuff that we've been talking about in terms of bottlenecks. And it consists more of user experience, what is the content, kind of business issues with respect to the content, the cost. Bill talked about in the last session, again, I thought it was an interesting point, of we may now be entering a system, we are entering a system where we've gone from the one size fits all, I just want to write one check, to Comcast, Charter, et cetera, and I get all my content, and that's all I have to worry about, to one in which now, some might argue, much less, I get tons of more content, but it's much less convenient, and in some respects can be more expensive in the way I get at it. But that is, that may be not less desirable for the consumer, but for those who, if you want a system in which people are incentivized to create content and to distribute it, then to some extent you have to live with, and by the way, in a world in which the advertising model, which for so long has undergirded this system of production and distribution, has been threatened because of the fragmentation among, both in technology, consumer behavior, and the proliferation of outlets. So if the advertising model is breaking down, and you're going to be looking at a model in which you've got to find more ways for people to pay for content, then that may be less convenient, it may be less, quote, desirable, but it's sort of a necessary shift in, in the environment. And a market power question in this area, or questions are really, to what extent do people have power over the things that matter most in the distribution of accessibility of video content, and that is around, the search function, the ability to find the content that you want and access, the content itself. And none of the major providers today, in terms of the infrastructure, are in any way dominant or even participant to a large extent in what that content is. The mobility of content, the ability to access it on many different platforms, not just one platform or not just one environment. And so I think that as we think about market power here, as opposed to the bottleneck kind of questions we've been talking about direct access, this is really, I think, a much more subtle set of metrics around how people are interfacing, accessing content, consuming it, and what kind of an overall ecosystem works, sets a balance amongst consumers, providers, and distributors. So that's kind of a setting the table maybe for some of the discussion to follow, but hopefully that's a helpful perspective. Are you on mute? I can't hear.
Oh, no.
Oh, really?
Oh,
sorry.
Oh, no.
Hang on. Can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Okay, good. I think that's great, because we're getting to content, which we really haven't focused on so far in this seminar. Anyway, the next person would be Robert Cohen, who's the Senior Fellow at the Economic Strategy Institute, and he is interested in particular on the evolution of IP networks, cloud computing, SDNs, big data providers, and in particular, he is interested in evaluating productivity gains, employment, and output benefits linked to the internet evolution. So, Robert, maybe you could pick it up here.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
No,
hear me?
I can, but you need to speak up.
Okay.
Is that better?
Yeah, much.
Okay. All right. So my approach is fairly different from the other presentations. If we could go to the next slide, I've basically been looking at the economic impact of the development of clouds, particularly the move to software-defined infrastructure, which is much more virtualized, and what that means. So I've got a couple of measures of market power in the kind of global cloud ecosystem in the next couple of slides. The first one is that a number of people have noted that what's happening as a result of the rise of clouds globally is that there's been a land grab to try to set up the main data centers that provide access to the cloud. And the winner of that land grab so far has been Amazon, which has, as of sometime next year, 71 data centers. Microsoft has roughly 30. AT&T, I think, also has around 28. I should have put them on here. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see another metric that shows, let's see. Okay, yeah. So the market power concerns I have are whether this land grab for data center is going to give cloud service providers the leverage to control the value chains that are being created by essentially businesses or other kinds of providers of different services around the globe. And might there be innovations in creating cloud services and intelligent ecosystems that give a more dominant position in value chains to others rather than cloud service providers? So some of the thoughts that I have is that there's a rise of new points of control like regional data or computing centers, and this might give cloud service providers like Amazon or Microsoft more market control. And there are rapid changes in software innovation that may shift power to dominant firms, resulting in something like the dominance we've seen with Apple over value chains for leading firms in many industries. Can we go down to the next slide then? Okay, so here's another way to look at the dominance in the cloud services environment. I've got Amazon here, Apple, let's see, Google, Goldman Sachs, and Bank of America. And you can see that Amazon, as I've estimated, has far more software engineers who are developing their code and helping manage their data centers and the ability to set up applications there. Apple and Google are not that far behind. Microsoft is probably somewhere in the vicinity of where Amazon is. So this kind of suggests that there's more of an oligopolistic structure, particularly as concerns the basic data centers that support the global cloud ecosystem. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so one of the things that I've been seeing is that we're moving towards a more intelligent software economy, that a number of larger companies have deployed a smart Internet of Things that's augmented with artificial intelligence and machine learning, and that the speed of software creation and the rapid diffusion of this intelligent software is in many ways changing the economy, and people like Vinod Khosla have said that this is creating an economy that's going to be orthogonal to the one that we know today, that higher power tools and capabilities are automating and adding intelligence to many industries. Deere can today let farmers see every plant in a field in fine detail, process that data, and then help farmers optimize how they're going to manage every field or row. So I think that there are new types of creators of information that are becoming important in this world if one looks at the business side. And software development is going to be lean and will radically accelerate the deployment or creation of new services and applications. It will take minutes to revise software, maybe even less. So could we go to the next slide down? Okay, so here what I've done is I've compared Moore's law to the time it takes to to either set up on the left, set up a new application in the data center, or create new software on the right. And as one can see, the blue line, which I consider to be software innovation, moves much more rapidly than Moore's law, that at the end of roughly a 13 to 15-year period or less, that software innovation is happening at an end pace which is roughly 100 times faster than Moore's law would lead us to suspect. Okay, next slide. So this leads to a rapidly changing world, and one of the most interesting evolutions I've seen, and this goes back to Bob Pepper's referring back to SAP. One of the things that SAP has been creating is the global factory. Brian just raised the question about GE Predix, which is having much less of an impact than I think SAP is. SAP is basically letting companies begin to link up real-time data, which is becoming far more video-oriented in single plants. And as the chart on the right shows, this is moving to essentially a national stage and then various facilities abroad. And by 2020 or so, there's an expectation that every part of the business, which is largely controlled by Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, as well as using computer vision and video as a means of seeing what's going on, will be integrated into a global ecosystem. And I think that this will change supply chains as well as trade. So I think we're not only going to see the linkage of the final points of production, but also links back to the entire supply chain that is connected to them, as well as connections to all of the supply chains involved in creating software. So if we could go down to the next slide. So one of the things that I think is key is this creation of global factories, that we're going to see companies like Caterpillar using this global integration, creating sort of a global ecosystem of intelligent software. And I think the key issue is, can cloud service providers gain the upper hand in the value chains that are at the base of these integrated ecosystems? And I'd like to refer to Buckley and Casson, who have studied multinational firms and identified two distinct forms of internalization that are key, both operational control or operational internalization in terms of how intermediate products flow through different stages in production, and then knowledge internalization, which is the flow of knowledge that emanates from R&D and possibly the control or knowledge of processes and markets. So I think that this broadens out the kind of economic factors that Bill mentioned earlier in the conference that are really key to what's going to happen to market control in the cloud environment. So I think that's my last slide. I don't think there are any more. I can't.
Oh no, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself. Oh no.
Oh no. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. Okay, Ellie, it's over to you. I don't think you need any introduction, except just to summarize and say you're probably the most prolific person on the planet when it comes to ICT.
Well, thank you, Ona, very much for that compliment. Well, sometimes it's not quantity that counts, but
It's quality, I know.
my most recent effort now is in fact about cloud TV and what I call cloud TV, cloud-based TV, and Bob Cohen's comments were actually kind of a good lead into that. He talks about kind of the cloud providers establishing control over the value chain, and I wondered if the same thing can be said now about cloud providers in the video entertainment news type environment, content. It used to be said for a long time that content is king. That was the mantra. The question is, though, whether that's going to be true in the future, and I think probably not. At least my analysis would show that if there's going to be a king, it's likely to be those cloud platform providers that are somewhere in between the users, the viewers, and the actual elements of content production, and they're being brought together in a variety of ways. And the reasons for cloud providers to become such a important force as they have now started to be and will kind of increase to do so is that they can do a variety of things, and they have a variety of things at their disposal that others don't have to the same extent. First, they do have data. They know about individuals and their viewers in ways that could not be done before or otherwise, so they can target and individualize content and marketing and advertising in new ways and powerful ways. Secondly, they function as bridges between different technologies. The notion that television is one size fits all technologically, as in the past, is not going to be true anymore and in the future. And so rather than having each individual end user be having to deal with multiple technologies of video that kind of are being sent to them, there is a bridge in between, and that's the cloud. So similarly, the bridging of technology standards, similarly, the bridging of different countries' rules and regulations when it comes to content. Sweden has one rule, and Germany has another one, and Zimbabwe might have a third one, and the United States certainly. And so rather than having content providers individually having to adjust their content to those different country rules, or rather than hoping for or fearing, perhaps is better, a global standard, which probably will not work well for anybody. Rather than that, there would be that intermediary that would adjust the streams or whatever it would be to the different countries' rules and regulations. Similarly, the cloud provider is also in the business, could be in the business of being kind of the clearance house for financial transactions of copyright holders and rights holders and participants and investors and so on. So there has to be somebody in the same way that Hollywood does it today, partly for its rights holders, in between kind of delivering the financial participation rights. Branding and curating is also an important function for those cloud providers, so that people will be able, in an environment of a plethora of content, will be able to kind of have some sense of what they're getting in terms of content and in terms of content. So, but in particular, it's the economies of scale. So when we put this all together, I think that we will have a number of cloud providers who will be extremely central in that emerging media environment, more so than in the past. And second, that there will be relatively few of them for the reasons of the economies of scale and other network effects, distance insensitivity, et cetera, that I already mentioned. And so that would mean, among other things, that in the future, these central media organizations will actually be more concentrated than in the past. The conventional wisdom has been, of course, that the new media system is less concentrated than the old one, but even today, that's not really what is happening. What the data shows in terms of just empiricism, and if you analyze it into the future, probably will not happen in the future either. And that, although of course there will always be exceptions, but the question is the center of gravity. Now, what are the implications? Some implications are power over media and power over users, for example, lock-in effects, fragmentation of possible gatekeeping powers of various kinds. Now, other problems that might emerge are some of them are the traditional ones, good old friends, but they will be applied to the new environment, such as national content requirements, a big thing in Europe and in Canada, protection of children, consumer protection, copyright protection, platform neutrality in terms of technology platforms, device platforms, interconnection issues, access issues, privacy, and so on and so forth. So there will be no shortage of issues that people will observe. Some of them might be real, some of them might be in the eyes of the beholder, some of them are hypothetical, but whatever it is, societies, countries, governments will be called upon to look at those issues. Now, will they kind of engage in some regulation? I suspect they will. And the reason is that societies and countries and governments have always done that to media. In the television field, it's been centered around the licensing of scarce broadcast spectrum, but that was just the nexus. That was not really the reason, because some of those regulations have been kept on for cable television where the same shortage does not exist. And as we can see now in Europe, the extension of broadcast rules onto OTT, linear type has also been done. So it's not really scarcity, it's societal values, societal priorities. And there's no reason to believe that just because something travels over in an IP way is going to be therefore treated in a meaningful way differently, that those goals of society will have shifted, even though the tools might be shifted. And that gets us then to the question, if some regulatory arrangements would be taken up, what could those be? What could those be? And there are different models. We all know that. Print model, a layered model of technology, TV model, public TV model, film model, the telecom model, and I suspect actually that despite the fact that telecom regulation has been kind of declining, that nevertheless some of the tools of it are going to be actually emerging and re-emerging, as we can see now already in the net neutrality type debate. And the reasons are that some of those telecom tools, and by the way, this is not a defense of anything, it's just kind of an observation of how these things will work themselves out, that these cloud providers will be regulated in a variety of ways through a kind of essential facilities, some public utility stuff, some necessity and ability to collect taxes for government, a delegation of regulatory compliance over what is happening over them, and we can see that already in the debate over hate speech and fake news that is emerging. And one of the reasons why there would be kind of the nexus for regulation is because there's so few of them, and so therefore by regulating a few who happen also to have market power and ability to maintain some control, it is a relatively efficient from a governmental perspective way, whereas content providers might be tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, cloud platform providers are not. And so some of the tools that might be there are And again, please, this is not an endorsement. I think there will be some return of, dare I say, licensing. Of course, it's not going to be called licensing. It's going to be called registration, but then the registration will be supplemented by some conditions. And so pretty soon you have virtually a licensing type system. There will be an extension of liability rules and responsibility for content and for people's behavior. At the same time, of course, and that is a conflict we see right now, there are also non-discrimination requirements. So at the same time that you want to police, you also have to be non-discriminatory, which is a very tricky thing to do, in fact, practically impossible. There might be rules on structural separation, vertical disintegration, up to the point of even kind of breakups along the Telecom AT&T model of the past. There might be interconnection and access requirements. There might be device neutrality, connection of equipment, privacy protection, security minimum standards and disclosure requirements, and so on. So, and there will be different national approaches to all this, but clouds can reconcile different national approaches. That's one thing they can do. And so, the importance of this issue and the discussion that we're having is that in the future, much of next generation media applications will run over the internet, and the internet is fairly loosely defined to include also mobile, etc. It's fixed line and wireless pathways. Music, video, film, text, interactive games, online, news media, etc., etc. And therefore, as the internet becomes the platform for most media users, and as clouds become the major platforms for media applications, the regulatory rules over the internet become also the rules for much of the media system as a whole. So it's not just regulating the internet that is the issue, but it's regulating the media system as a whole. And that is kind of makes this question really not only important for now, but even more so important for the future. Thank you. Over. Oh no, you must unmute yourself.
I did.
Oh no, we cannot hear you. Oh no, we cannot hear you.
I keep unmuting, but...
No, you're okay now. You're okay now.
Okay, I don't know, something about BT broadband then, you know? So, thank you very much, all of you guys. There were just a few points I wanted to add on before we get on to questions, because I see that some of the participants are lining up here. In terms of market power, I just wanted to throw out a few facts that I haven't updated in the last year or two, but if you look at Apple, who is not only a content provider, music, video, and distributor, they're so dominant that, for example, you know, they're sitting on 140 billion in cash. Their market valuation is so high that this according to a study done about 2 years ago, but 40% of fund managers and asset managers said that they do benchmarking of their and their competitors' performance and the performance of indices relative to one another by excluding Apple from indices. So if they take the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ, they exclude Apple earnings. I mean, and as long ago as 5 years ago, Apple was worth $425 billion. It's a huge consumer platform. It's always leveraging strategic advantage by selling ever-improved devices, which we, as users, continually upgrade. So they really are in a dominant position, which gets me to Ellie's point. Can you hear me?
You've cut out now.
Am I back on?
Yeah. Just
Howard, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you, yep.
Okay, yeah, I guess you lost a bit of the data there, but not to worry. Anyway, that gets me to Ellie's point about an oligopoly, which I think is definitely the evolution of market structure in the TMT or ICT, depending on what you call it, sector, which nonetheless is responsible for 20% of market growth in every major index, market index worldwide. And that goes back to the last 15 years since I began calculating it. So, we did have, in my opinion, monopolistic competition in telecoms and media in the early to mid 90s. You know, when there was so much innovation in mobile phones, and that was the big deal. Now it seems to be an increasing convergence to the dominance across several layers of media, of data, provision, and transportation. You know, these people we call the FANGs or the gay mans or whoever they are. So that gets us to the question of bottlenecks, and do these large companies have, in fact, such strategic advantage that, yes, they can buy rather than build, they have tons of money to build, billions in free cash, and they already have these huge consumer platforms and such powerful brands that it's hard to see how startups can actually survive. That being said, I mean, the Facebook IPO in 2014 at 100 billion seemed like a huge bubble, but look at what happened to Facebook. So I think Ellie's right that it's an oligopolistic market structure is evolving, if not already in place. And that gets us to the role of regulation, which several people have touched on, and what the appropriate role of the regulator is. Can you still hear me, Howard?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, good. Because this brings me back to, in an environment of such rapid change, consolidation in some levels and fragmentation in others, it reminds me of Alfred Kahn's position. It was a concluding comment in a 1990 article in the Yale Journal on Regulation. He wrote about deregulation, looking backward and looking forward, and he said, this is, in a sense, my paper, only an expression of a preference for seeking consistently to move in the direction of the first best functioning of a market economy, rather than the second or third best world of centralized command and control. I mean, his paper was really about how the evolution of regulatory policy for information and information technology and telecoms, media, etc., was a spiral rather than a pendulum in his head, because the pendulum would take us back to the origin, which is actually kind of interesting in the context of Ellie's point just now about how there are so many angles of regulatory policy from the old days in telecoms and media that still have relevance and will continue to have relevance, mostly because of the special role of information and communications in not just economies, but society. Ellie touched on some of the dormant issues which will resurface, and that reminded me of Loretta and Anania's point about the difference between the EU and the US. And apologies, I don't know so much about the Asia-Pacific situation, but I think Tom actually sort of touched on the fact, too, that there's so much more innovation in the US. And at the same time, it's important that things like privacy and information, well, consumer protection, as well as standardization, maintaining open standards, but protecting consumers, as Ellie touched on, is important. And I wondered if Loretta could get back to me or us about the right to be forgotten, which the EU made an issue, the European Commission, in 2012 to 2014, but I'm a bit out of touch there. Anyway, yeah?
Can we, the panelists, kind of have some?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Over to you.
I wanted to say that I think we've already seen moves towards industrial policy for controlling market power in the cloud area that really haven't been recognized, particularly the European GDPR, the data protection regulations. I was at the Cloud Expo conference that was held a few weeks ago. There was a long discussion of how that's affecting not only European companies, but that American companies are treating this almost as a global regulation that will affect all of the U.S. firms, given the size of the fines. So I think one of the things that's been left out of the discussion of clouds here is that we're already seeing industrial policy being applied to how clouds will function to try to tilt the table and help. I think the Europeans play much more of a role in the emergence, and we've seen some of that also happening in China, where the Chinese have tried to promote almost the conglomeration of some of the data service providers like Alibaba, that there are many, many more functions, both entertainment and business, under one umbrella.
Lovely. Yeah, I agree with you there. Ellie, you wanted to come in?
I wanted to ask Bob and possibly also Howard whether, in fact, they do expect that Bob made a point about the clouds kind of gaining control over the various processes more general, whether he thinks that that applies to video too, and in what way. And secondly, if Howard, from a perspective of media insider, sees that actually happening, and what it means for the traditional media companies, whether they can keep up with that.
Bob, you want to go first, and I'll chime in?
Yeah, I'll try to be short. I think that everything, is data traffic and how that's managed and controlled. And I think the growth of Amazon Web Services illustrates what we're seeing, that it's not the Apples of the world that are going to be controlling how the cloud picture gets clarified, but more the Amazons and Microsofts and maybe other entities from China. So I think that if we look at this in terms of all data is the king, then the real data networks that are evolving are going to be so central that they'll be the platform for almost anything that involves bits. So I think we have to start to look at regulatory frameworks in terms of the whole digitalization and virtualization of things that we haven't really integrated in the regulatory framework up to now.
Ellie, my take on your point is I think that the media world has, for decades, if not, literally since its inception, been a world of oligopoly domination. I mean, it was, the print business, newspapers. Yes, there were newspapers all over the country, and many of which have, we know their story, but there were large newspaper chains that certainly have dominated that business for a long time. The radio business very quickly became one, and with which a couple of dominant, certainly dominant networks on the content side. We have in television, several major networks, more station owner groups, but again, still in each local market, a very small number of providers have always been the dominant and sort of, defining nature of that. I think for the media industry, the biggest fear right now is not in a kind of an oligopoly of cloud providers as it is the digital duopoly of Facebook and Google when it comes to advertising. That really, that we have existed certainly through both in the print business and in the electronic video world with the cable business, a dual revenue stream. where it was circulation in newspapers, subscriber fees in television, and advertising. And both of those help fuel the business, not just for the publishers, but for the creators of content. And in Facebook and Google, certainly to date, in the development of digital advertising, they're almost the only people making any money. The latest figures are they take roughly 75% of the share of digital advertising dollars. They take roughly 99% of the growth in digital advertising. So if we go to a world in which that legacy business, the television platform, radio platform, etc., continue to shrink and shrink dramatically to the point that lose the great value and leverage of their scale. Right now, we're in a world in which on the digital side, there are really no other major players in advertising. And the legacy media companies are attempting to find ways to work together. You have Viacom, Turner, and Fox creating what's called Open AP, which is a system of defining audiences in the same fashion, which will help advertisers more easily buy across each of their networks in an audience-based world as opposed to a Nielsen-based world. So as that advertising world for traditional media companies is so threatened, they're looking at the same time, the subscriber fee world is entirely threatened because people are looking for alternatives to the big cable bundle. And as they gravitate towards smaller platforms, skinny bundles, niche services, whether it's Sling TV or Hulu or Amazon Prime or DirecTV Now or Philo, which was announced 3 days ago, whatever it is, those are alternatives of seeking to at least maintain the subscriber fee part of the world, but their greatest threat is the digital duopoly of Facebook and Google, no question.
The other factor that probably should be mentioned here is that cloud has evolved to where application protocol interfaces are letting people link to almost anything. So pretty much any video provider or creator could link to somebody that wants to use that video. And that could serve as a way for breaking down all of these currently controlled platforms like Google and Facebook, so that new competitors could really chip away without very much of a startup cost, because creating these APIs is very, very low cost, so it could really change the barriers to entry. You could really see a very different structure of market power if those really provide a way of disrupting the way the current markets function.
Ellie, that's kind of an alternative perspective.
I hope so.
Could I possibly, I want to suggest that some people from the audience have been chatting. For example, TJ Jitsusumi from Japan. We haven't heard very much from Asia today. Maybe he wants to add something that he addressed in his chat.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Hi. Unfortunately, I'm the expert of the content business, but the situation is quite similar in Japan. Although Google is not the strongest player in Japan, Yahoo is as strong as Google itself. And Google and Yahoo is currently dominating the market of the online advertisement. But still, it's a free competition. The fact that they're dominating the market does not guarantee the regulation of the market itself. As long as it's a free market, government cannot see any problem, and that is the situation right now. However, Recently, the Japanese Fair Trade Commission issued a report about the possibility of the data usage of those big players. They say that they are trying to watch the data gathering of those big players, and if they do such big data to damage the competitive situation, they think that they're ready to intervene. But as long as there's no such situation, there's no reason for the government to intervene. That's the situation in Japan right now.
Sorry, I'm just looking for your comments. But I'm scrolling down. It just occurs to me there are an awful lot of comments I didn't realize on this issue. Would anyone like to raise their hand?
Or just jump in.
Yeah, there's so many comments. They're flowing from one panel to the next. Apple is blocking, from Harry Shapiro, Apple is blocking Facebook instant article features that allow for paid access to content unless they get a cut of the income. This gets back to my point. I mean, not only are they so powerful, but for example, their performance versus the S&P 500 between 2007 and 2015, they grew 500%, whereas the S&P average was minus 5%. So I guess I still favor Ellie's position that it's evolving oligopolistically. I don't see how. I agree with Bob that, you know, APIs follow rapid innovation. The question is how to get the money to leverage those apps in competition with the Facebooks and the Googles and the Apples and the Microsofts of this world. Ellen Ross, everyone, how do you join in voice? You just click on chat.
No, you can. No. Ona.
Yeah.
Ellen, if she unmutes her microphone, she can start speaking.
Ellen, are you?
Ellen? Oh, she's connected by. Oh, she's a. Oh. Ellen doesn't seem to be connected or participating. Is there anybody else who would like to address this panel? Otherwise, perhaps we can, since we're close to the end, we can lead the final.
Yeah, just one thing occurs to me. There was a webinar I attended out of New York last week, and there was a huge survey done, a very comprehensive survey done of people who would invest in clouds. And it was focusing on asset managers, banks, insurance providers, people like that. Well, basically, 80% of them would never put data of any sort onto a cloud, not even a private cloud. 5% said they were developing their own private clouds, but 80% said, no way, we can't afford it. And certainly that they had no interest in clouds because of the encryption, the data security, the privacy. They can be fined vast amounts, as we've seen in recent years, because of leaks. So, I mean, there are areas where the cloud is really important, noticeably on the consumer side, but there are whole industries, notwithstanding what Bob pointed out, which was really instructive, but there are industry segments where the cloud is really not an issue. Anyway, that's the point.
Okay.
That's not really true. If one looks at the cloud native and the open source movement, many more companies are building their own clouds to stay away from the cloud service providers unless they really need to use them. And this is a trend that's happening broadly across, you know, the auto industry, very much in finance and in information technology. It's really shifting the balance and the power away from some of the cloud service providers, at least in the industrial community. And that's a very interesting new trend, because while it does require skills in the companies to be able to do some of it themselves. They can outsource for skills that they don't have. And so we see, I mean, in that chart that I put up, you can see firms like Goldman Sachs or Bank of America better have something like 20,000 software engineers.
Software engineers,
For
yeah.
an IT company that does financial operations.
All right.
Yeah.
I had a question for the panel.
Yeah?
Yeah, so the right to be forgotten law in Europe and Argentina, I see. What unintended consequences are there? I mean, obviously they're cutting off the internet in terms of its memory, you know, from the whole point of the cloud seems to be that there are no national or local boundaries. What, you know, what can you tell me about this? I can't find out in Wikipedia. What are the unintended consequences of relation of that nature?
Sorry, Tom, you're asking Ellie?
Yeah, anybody who wants to address it. Maybe Loretta's still in the audience. Maybe she might want to talk about it.
I think she left.
Let me just say briefly. I don't think it's a good that the right to be forgotten, particularly the way in which it has been is a particularly good way to go. And I am an advocate of privacy. So that said, my issue is so much whether countries can or regions can establish good rules or foolish rules. The fact is that they will do so, and that those rules will vary, and that the coordination of provision of media content or applications that does have to comply with, say, a right to be forgotten in one area and no such similar rules in another area is a fairly complex operational type skill set. And that some companies will actually be in the business of doing so, and the most logical ones are the cloud providers. Howard, do you have any comments on that? I guess not. The time also has kind of come up to script up with us, and so I think this panel is at its concluding point, and I would like to thank Ona very much for coming back and to CITI virtually, electronically. Thank you very much, Ona, and also to Bob Cohen and to Howard Helmanoff and to myself. So,
thank you, Ali.
Thank you.
Okay, now I will don my last hat, which is moderating the conclusion, which can be fairly brief, and because we, by design, not put any speaker in here, in order to make it possible for you, the other participants, to make comments, to ask of each other and of the remaining speakers. And at the conclusion thereof, I want to also say some words of thanks, and then we conclude and go to lunch, at least on the East Coast of the United States. So, are there any hands up or volunteers who kind of want to jump into this and make some observations? We had some fairly active chatters. One of them was Harry
Shapiro, yeah.
Brian Savin, if he's still in, Martin, etc. So why don't you guys start this off?
I can say something very quick, which again is that I think that all of the rights of way and restrictions very locally have all these harmonic effects on the upper levels of the stack, and it's perhaps old news, but I think all of my comments flow from that. It's been an amazing conference, and I think you really hit on a lot of key issues, and thanks for putting it on.
Thank you very much, Harry, for these kind words, but I think that last mile bottleneck has been discussed extensively, so I don't think that we could add very much to it. And it's not a reflection of thinking that it is not important. It's just it's done. The others Of course, we did not invent these things from the de novo, but nevertheless, I think they receive less attention. Maybe the FANG GAFAM has received increasing attention, though, and that will be with us, and Europeans certainly, and other places in the world, Brazil and China and so on, have kind of expressed significant issues and problems there. Are there any other hands or jump in points of people here? Everybody is in violent agreement here. What I have heard was that the middle mile issue doesn't seem to be much of an issue, which to some extent I must say surprised me. Maybe there was kind of the composition of the panel or the composition of the audience, I don't know. But when I kind of go around, people often will mention that as a serious bottleneck. However, it usually tends to be not really kind of company people who have encountered, or content providers who have encountered these bottlenecks, and more people who have heard or read that these bottlenecks, middle mile bottlenecks, exist. We have not heard much about them, and if somebody here wants to add their observations on that, that would be certainly helpful. But otherwise, we perhaps can say this is an issue to be watched, but it's not something that has kind of emerged in as serious a way as the last mile, or that is likely to emerge in a more serious way as in the cloud platforms, which I suspect will happen, and that some of these cloud providers platforms, in fact, will be those FANGs, GAFAM companies. Not all of them. For example, Netflix is not a platform provider and not a kind of infrastructure platform provider in the same way that Amazon, say, or Google are. But nevertheless, serious companies, and where serious companies have market power in the media field, governments and activists tend to get busy in trying to address those issues and possibly remedy them in a variety of ways. And so these issues are with us, will be with us for good, and that makes it both challenging and interesting. Old battles, it seems like kind of no issues ever gets resolved. They just kind of new issues emerge in more serious ways. Privacy in the television field was not a big issue, but in the online OTT world of video, it's becoming a much bigger issue. So the issues might not be new, but the composition changes, and therefore the responses might also not be always new, but their composition changes too. So we will have opportunity to discuss these things in the future too. Let me come to the last words of thanks. In addition to the speakers and to the moderators, I would like in particular to thank Jason Buckwat, who has put this conference together, both in terms of content, speakers, but also in terms of announcements, of kind of audience, and in particular also in the technology side. So he's really been holding this together, and we owe him great thanks. Corey Spencer, who assisted him and me in doing so, our assistant director. Thank you all very much. And in the design of the program, I also want to thank Bob Pepper and Bob Atkinson, who were supportive to us with ideas and concepts. So I thank everyone, and to you, the audience, in numerous countries. Quite amazing distribution from here. We had about 70 or 75 people here in easily 15 countries. So thank you very much for joining from wherever you are, and thank you, and we will see you hopefully soon.
Ellie, this was wonderful. The virtual conference? Congratulations.